Hear all these stories anywhere you listen to podcasts on the Let's Read podcast. My granddaddy was a Texas Ranger back during the Great Depression. He passed when I was just a kid, so most of the stories about him I got from my dad, but some of them are some real doozies, and this is probably the one that sticks with me the most. As you can probably imagine, the Great Depression meant a lot of folks turned to crime to make ends meet, and those already raking in ill-gotten gains had to really kick things up a gear to maintain the kind of lifestyle they'd become accustomed to. As a consequence, Cochran County became the bank robbery capital of West Texas, with banks and credit unions in Morton, Whiteface, and Bledsoe getting hit on a daily basis sometimes. A lot of the folks who robbed the Bledsoe Credit Union tried skipping over the border into New Mexico, but the feds got wise to them whizzing off along the 125 and started posting officers over in Tantum where they could head them off and take them into custody. But then, not everyone tried burning rubber down the 125, and a lot more folks seemed to be getting away than my grandpappy and his fellow rangers would have liked. One time, grandpappy trying to track this one bank robber across the state, and this son of a bitch shot a female clerk after she spooked him, so there's no shortage of tips coming in from folks who think they spotted either him or his getaway car. One of these tips is from a guy who said he was 99% sure that he spotted the getaway car in the parking lot of some isolated motel called the Yellow Rose. Granddaddy drives out there to talk to the proprietors, who turn out to be this nice old couple living out a kind of semi-retirement out there in the middle of nowhere. They said the place used to be fairly lively back before Wall Street crashed, but by 1932, it was nothing but a glorified retirement home for him. Hardly anyone stopped by anymore, and whenever they did, the two old-timers didn't bother keeping any kind of record. They just let folks pay their 50-cent rate, pick up any room they like, and then check out whenever they cared to. Grandpappy said that they were both sweet as pie, and they answered all of his and his partner's questions, and they let them both take a look around the place to their heart's content, and they promised they'd be in touch if they remembered anything else. But as far as they knew, Grandpappy's suspect never stopped by, and if his getaway car was spotted in the motel's parking lot, the guy certainly didn't check in with them at the front desk. Grandpappy thanks them for their time, recommends they start making records just in case they have to stop by again, and then off he and his partner go to chase up other clues. But the trail goes cold, and before long, they're forced to focus on other fugitives. A few months go by and my grandpappy and his partner are chasing up some other suspect in some completely unrelated bank robbery, when the name of the Yellow Rose Motel pops up again. This time, it's a guest who claimed to just so happen to have spotted grandpappy's suspect walk into a room carrying the exact same kind of bag used in a liquor store robbery. Again, it seems like they're hot on their suspect's tails, but then they roll up to the Yellow Rose and it was pretty much the same story as last time. No, they didn't have any records of the guy staying there, but they did vaguely remember who my grandpappy was talking about after he showed them both a photograph, and aside from that, there were no help. At that stage, grandpappy and his partner weren't exactly suspicious of the old couple, but they were getting a tad frustrated at how unhelpful they were being. They could be forgiven on account of their age and dispositions, but still, Grandpappy felt like if it were any other motel, he'd have both his robbery suspects in cuffs. And so, a few more months go by and then, yep, you guessed it, the name The Yellow Rose Motel pops up in the witness reports of armed robbery suspect. Once again, Grandpappy and his partner drive out there to talk to the owners, only this time, they catch them in a lie. The witness said the suspect had seemed nervous and unwilling to leave their room. This meant the older man of the couple had to head out to the guy's room every time he had an issue, and apparently he had many. The man admitted to having talked to the suspect, but at first tried to act confused as to which guest the Rangers were talking about. But then, when Grandpappy asked if he'd been in the guy's room, long enough to get a real good look at him, the guy lied and said no. Grandpappy and his partner played it cool. They didn't immediately throw the guy up against the wall and accuse him of lying. That wasn't their style. Instead, they made it look like they were taking the guy at his word and then went off trying to figure out how that nice old couple were connected to the suspects. And Grandpappy's partner thought that it was fairly simple. The old couple were offering shelter to the robbers, so long as they gave them a cut of their take. Rent wasn't 50 cents for folks. Oh no, it was more like 50-100, which back then was a heck of a lot of money. And the only problem was Grandpappy and his partner had to prove that this was happening, and considering they'd already searched the place pretty thoroughly without anything being found, they knew that wasn't going to be easy. They had to wait months before they heard anything else about the Yellow Rose, and when they did, Grandpappy and his partner just about broke the speed limit rushing to get that scoop. The lead was some bandito, some other agency had already apprehended and locked up. He figured his partner had screwed him over on the job, and so he wanted to get even. He told my Grandpappy that his partner had not only driven off without him, leading to his arrest, but he stiffed him for half of the money too. And the plan was that if either of them got caught, and one got away with the money, they were to make sure that the other's family was well looked after while they were in prison. The partner had failed to do this, so the prisoner was pissed. He tells Grandpappy all about their plan, which was to head to the place called the Yellow Rose, which helped criminals escape the law in exchange for a cut of the loot. Grandpappy's partner is just about hooting and hollering like, I knew it, dagnammit, I knew it all along. But a crucial piece of the puzzle was still missing. Grandpappy still had no idea how the old couple were helping their guest disappear, and neither did the prisoner, so there was no putting them in cuffs till they figured that out. They thought about it for weeks on end, with their assistant chief breathing down their necks and demanding results. And then in the end, Grandpappy and his partner came up with a plan. They were going to enlist the help of a third ranger, one the elderly couple hadn't met yet, and they were going to send him in undercover as a potential bank robber-looking type guy to buy their services. They thought the idea was foolproof, especially after their fellow ranger got himself firmly into character. They were dealing with low-down, no-good sons of bitches on a nearly daily basis, so imitating one was as easy as falling off a log. And all they had to do was be patient, gain a little trust, and then they were on for a stakeout. So the first step was obviously to have their ranger buddy approach the couple while undercover, to see if they'd help him disappear. He walks in, a couple of minutes go by, then out he comes with a bona fide verbal guarantee that if he shows up with the law on his tail, and he pays them a couple $100, they'll help him vamoose on down to Mexico where the law will never find him. And after that, it was just a case of picking a date and time, playing a phony news bulletin over the radio so the couple really believed there had been a robbery, and having their ranger roll up on the Yellow Rose, tires screeching, and with a big old bag of money. On the day of the undercover job, my Grandpappy and his partner went up to a water tower about a half-mile from the Yellow Rose, and they watched the whole thing unfold through a pair of binoculars. The man rolls up, doing close to 100, runs into the check-in office like a man possessed, and then starts yelling about how the cops are on his tail and he needs hiding. The older man helps hide his car in the garage around back. Then they show him where their secret hiding spot is for their wanted fugitives. Grandpappy and his partner are watching as they take their undercover ranger buddy out of sight, with the plan being that when the couple show him what they do with the fugitive, he pulls a gun and 2 pairs of cuffs and then arrests them both. Grandpappy and his partner had no real idea how long that was going to take, because how long is a piece of string, you know? But then 30 minutes go by, then an hour, then 2 hours, and they get to wondering what the hell is going on. There were no wires or anything back then, not like all the sophisticated doodads they got today, so they had to just sit and wait, getting more and more nervous until they decided to head in there themselves to search the place top to bottom again. But then, they do go in, and they go in heavy. They got rangers, local sheriff's deputies, even 2 federal agents that drove up from planes at short notice once they heard a Texas Ranger had gone missing. But it was the sniffer dogs that they brought along that found their missing ranger. And unfortunately, it wasn't because they were trained to smell people. Those dogs were trained to smell blood, and boy did they find a lot of it. Out back near the garage where the old-timer kept the fugitives' cars, there was an old rust bucket of a broken-down truck just sitting there. The dogs were all over it, or more specifically, they were sniffing at the ground underneath it before pointing like they had been trained to. The rangers had the broken-down truck moved, then they take a look at the patch of dirt more closely until they find what they're looking for. It was a carpet, or a sort of rug, and they brushed dirt and rocks over it, so unless you actually walk on top of the thing, there was no way of knowing it was there. They pulled it back, and right there in front of them was a big old iron hatch leading down into what I suppose you call these days a bunker. And inside that bunker was what can only be described as a kill factory. They had a kill room with a drain and hose for spraying off all the blood. They had a processing room where they could deal with the bodies. But they weren't just disposing of them in ways that no one would ever find them. The complete opposite situation, really. They were embalming and preserving these bodies with a sort of special kind of varnish to stop the skin from rotting, kind of like a taxidermist would. Then, when the bodies were all waxed and dressed and their hair was combed, they'd pose the bodies in a little room like they were all hanging out together. Worst thing is, they weren't doing it because they got a sick thrill out of it. At least the old couple claimed that wasn't the case. They were doing it because they felt bad for the people they killed. They only killed them to begin with because fugitives were bad folks, as they put it, and they never would have killed the ranger if they'd have known that he was an officer of the law. But unfortunately, the ranger left it a little too late to reveal his identity, and the old-timer hit him over the head with a hammer. And by the time the cops got there to rescue him, the old-timer had just about drained all the blood out of his body before processing. They couldn't go burying the bodies on their property, at least not without drawing too much attention. And so, they did what, according to them, was the next best thing. Created a kind of mausoleum where these bad men could hang out in a nice room with books, a record player, and a poker table. I'm deadly serious, too. They bought all that stuff with the money they got from their bank robbers. Saw it as the least they could do considering they murdered all those men. It wasn't just the 3 guys my grandpappy was looking for either. They killed 4 more criminals they figured had a bunch of ill-gotten money on their person, and they'd been at it for years too. It was a very big story around Cochran County at the time, but I guess it never took off around the county because there was no big trial to play out for the cameras. The older man had a heart attack in his prison cell, and it turned out his wife was dying of cancer anyways because she passed away in the night before they could even get her arraigned. Dad said Grandpappy never did get over sending his ranger buddy in there first. Always said it should have been him. And I guess that's why he drank so much, which is why he passed when I was just a kid. And so all in all, I guess that old couple played quite a significant role in my family's history. And it's a hell of a thing to consider. Even worse when you remember they considered themselves good people. My husband had remained close to his childhood friend, who I'll call John, well into adulthood. They had met in elementary school and became inseparable ever since. When I was dating my husband and met John, I thought he was such a nice guy. He had a very docile nature and a wholesome character. Everyone felt comfortable around him. John was the type of person that could get along with anyone. He was trustworthy, dependable, and genuinely kind. I was happy that my husband was able to keep such a good friend in this day and age when true friendships are so hard to find. Both me and my husband are estranged from our families, so we were lucky to have someone like John in our lives, and we considered him like family. John was a nerd, like us, so we had many of the same interests. We would meet up every once in a while to grab something to eat, catch a movie, or just hang out at the house playing retro board games and discussing technology. We all three had a love of computers, so my husband and John often shared with each other small programs that they could write. My husband and I built computers for a time, and John would come by to give his opinion and advise us on our projects. I suppose the only curious thing about John at that point was that he never really had a girlfriend. In all the years we knew him, he had always been single. He never even dated. I didn't understand why such a nice guy hadn't found someone yet. Our lives seemed to evolve and change, but John just sort of stayed where he had always been, living with his family, and never became involved with anyone romantically. And for a while there, we started thinking that maybe he was gay and was simply scared to reveal it, since he had a pretty traditional family who he was very close to. And though we wandered amongst ourselves, we never brought it up to him, as it seemed kind of inappropriate. It would be like we were invading his privacy or meddling in his life, and we figured that he would eventually find someone when he was ready. John suddenly moved away to a city that was 3 hours away. When he told us, we thought at first that he had decided to finally move on his own, but we were wrong. He had actually moved into a home that his older sister had bought for her retirement. Since she wasn't ready to retire just yet, she was letting him stay there for the time being, and that's when things began to change. John sort of fell off the map. He wouldn't call, he wouldn't visit, nor ask us to come visit him. My husband and I figured it was because of the distance. Also, he was probably settling into his new place and getting accustomed to a new city. But time continued passing, and I could tell my husband was really missing his friend. And I had to admit that I was too. We had such good times together, and it was so unlike John to disconnect like that. It was so difficult to get in contact with him on the phone, and he wasn't very active on his social media either. And I started to worry about him. I also didn't want my husband to continue distancing himself from his best friend, as it could become permanent. And so I made it my mission to reignite our friendship. I called John and arranged for us to go visit him. Surprisingly, he didn't seem to even acknowledge the fact that it had been about 2 years since we had last seen each other. When we arrived at his place, I was taken a little aback, as I hadn't been expecting what I saw. The house was in a pretty secluded neighborhood in the middle of nowhere, actually, and I didn't know how he could get used to it here, going from a big city and all. And also, I hate to say this, but the house seemed dirty and messy, and John told us that he had transferred his job to this new city. Even though they offered him a promotion, he had declined it, and he didn't want to work the extra hours. I looked around and thought that this made sense, since it seemed like John didn't like leaving the house very much, and I chuckled to myself as I thought the house looked more like a bunker than a home. To my dismay, I saw that John had his own room, as if he was still a teenager. In fact, it was decorated as if that is exactly what he still was. It was a mess in there. Computers and computer equipment on the floor, wires everywhere, clothes thrown about all over the place. And John said his sister came to stay every other weekend, so she had the main bedroom for herself. He expressed how he hated for his privacy to be interrupted when she stayed over, but what could he do? And I thought to myself that he could just get his own place, but I didn't say it out loud. We all decided to go to dinner and browse some of the stores in the area, and I couldn't help myself any longer and asked John why we had lost contact. It had become so difficult to get a hold of him lately, and he kind of just shrugged it off and said that he had been so busy with the move that he must have lost track of time. He didn't ever want to lose contact like that with us again, and he appeared genuine, but something felt off to me. His answers were too short and generic, as if there had been some sort of script or he'd practiced somehow. My husband told him that he thought that he would have had his own place by now since he moved all the way out here, and John said that it was just financially easier this way. Again, another short and very generic reply. I asked him if he was seeing anyone, and he said that he wasn't in a position to really do that right now, as he really wanted to get his finances in order first. I thought that every reply he gave made sense and was perfectly reasonable, but I also knew that he was lying. Rather, he was hiding. I just didn't know what it was. It was just this nagging feeling that I couldn't shake off, and John just didn't seem like the person that we had known once. My husband and I drove home, kind of confused but glad that we had spent some time with our old friend, and it had been a long time coming. John certainly answered all of the questions that we had been curious about. We believed that now that we had resumed contact that we would see more of him, but that didn't happen. John continued to be distant. His social media continued to not be updated, but I did notice something strange. Since I have him as a friend, I could see whatever he did that was public. And I noticed that he was liking Nickelodeon programs and would sometimes make comments on their posts. The comments would just mention how good a show's last episode was or how he couldn't wait to find out what happened next. And I found this kind of odd. His comments also seemed to have been written by someone much younger and not a man in his late 30s, who still watched kids' programs at that age. Oh well, I just chalked it up to John always having been sort of innocent, I guess. And besides, some adults still watch cartoons, right? And I suppose there isn't anything too weird then with an adult liking kids' sitcoms. And I didn't mention it to my husband. I'm not sure why. I just felt like I was, once again, a little nosy, invading John's privacy somehow. After all, it's not like I had purposely searched for this information. Besides, what would be the point of even mentioning it? It's just TV shows. And over the next couple of years, John visited us one time. Once again, I had to make a monumental effort to get him to meet with us, even though he traveled our way often to visit his mother. And I got this uncanny feeling that John was avoiding us. Again, as if he was hiding, but hiding what? My husband had pretty much accepted the fact that his friendship had somehow grown apart, and things would never be as they were before. No point of continuing to force the situation, and I resigned myself to that fact as well. It happens. I figured it happened more commonly with childhood friends since people do tend to go in different directions in adulthood. Some more time passed and my husband mentioned John to me. He told me that he had wondered what he'd been up to and how it seemed like no matter how hard he tried, he kept losing contact with him. I could tell my husband was annoyed and couldn't call John because he was upset, and I decided to just give him a call myself. I hoped he still had his same number, and luckily he did. John informed me that he had recently moved back in with his mother. She needed him to be closer to her due to her ailing health, and I told him it was good he was back because we were planning on visiting my father so we could swing by and see him as well. And for the first time, John actually sounded strained and evasive. It didn't sound like himself at all. He told me that he really hadn't been expecting to move back, so he was having trouble getting settled in. And for this reason, he said that he would not be able to meet with us this soon. We would have to meet the following month. And that struck me as strange since his mother's house was the house he grew up in. He had his own bedroom there, so why would it be so difficult to settle in? I accepted his wishes though and told him that the following month we would plan on hanging out for sure. Nothing could have prepared me and my husband for what happened next though. As the month we were supposed to meet approached, my husband called me to come downstairs and look at the TV. He then said to hurry, and I thought he was just being dramatic since he sometimes did so to get me to go see what he was watching, so I reluctantly went downstairs. I immediately noticed that he was white as a sheet. Now he had my attention, and I asked him what in the world was wrong now. He told me to look at this as he holds the remote in his hand, pointing it to the TV. And I sat down next to him and he starts playing a news segment that was showing a courtroom. Suddenly, John is led in by a bailiff wearing an orange suit with his hands and feet shackled. And I literally did a double take as I couldn't believe that it was the same person. I thought my husband was joking and was playing a video showing John or a look-alike like John, but there was no denying it was truly him. His full name was right there on the screen. The newscaster said that yet another man, John, has just been arrested in connection with one of the largest child trafficking rings that has been dismantled in recent history. John was just one of the many individuals who had been caught when the police successfully obtained their information from a website on the dark web that had been shut down for featuring and spreading CSAM, or child exploitation material. The investigation had been going on for a few years, Both of our mouths were wide open as we stared at the TV in disbelief. My husband told me that he had been searching for a local TV show when he came across this. He told me he just couldn't believe it. He must have watched it over 20 times before he called me downstairs to see for myself, and I was speechless. Sometime later, when the initial shock subsided, my husband went online to search more information, and it appears that John's mother's home and his sister's home had both been raided, and they found hundreds of child exploitation content on his computer. John must have been collecting them since his youth. There also had been a DNA match. There wasn't much more information than that, and I was thankful for it as neither of us wanted to know what exactly that meant. John is going to be going to prison for the next 30 plus years, and he'll be an old man by the time he makes it to his first parole hearing and would have to wear an ankle monitor for the remaining years if he was ever to actually be released. And we saw that his sister removed his name from the house that she had bought. She also removed all mention of him from her social media. And for his family to have disowned him, the details of what John did must be truly horrific, and it's obvious his family has no doubt of his guilt. I feel so sorry for his poor mother. She was such a sweet lady. She had already lost 2 sons, and now she lost a third. My husband and I removed John from our contact list and any trace of him from our social media as well. We severed all ties. We decided to not even contact his family, and we will not be visiting him in prison either, though we have so many unanswered questions. This event broke my husband somehow. He has become very paranoid and distrustful of other people, and he's refused to make any new friends. I can understand him, though. It's life-changing when you realize that you never truly know anyone, regardless of how close you are to them. Not really, anyway. The sweet, humble guy that had slept in our home and shared so many great times with us had been an illusion. A very good magic trick. It's as if he hadn't ever existed except in our own minds. John had been hiding something after all, and he had been hiding that he was really a monster. Many years ago, I decided to take a road trip from Florida to New Mexico to visit my adopted Aunt Linda. She's my adopted aunt because, well, I didn't have much family growing up, and since she was years older than me and treated me like family, I just started calling her my aunt one day, and it kind of stuck. We first met when we were living in Clearwater, but she developed respiratory problems as she got older and moved to live with an old friend of hers in the drier climates near Albuquerque. We had a sort of tradition of having a fancy day from time to time, where we'd really treat ourselves, go shopping, then go eat somewhere incredibly fancy as like a sort of big morale booster. And when we first met, I wasn't doing so great. I was young and fresh out of a relationship, and part of being my shoulder to cry on was taking our very first fancy day, which fast became a tradition. And so to save enough money as possible on that trip, so I could spend as much money as I wanted while I was in Albuquerque, I started looking for cheaper hotels and motels outside of Shreveport city limits, which is where I usually spent the night after around 12 to 13 hours of driving. I found what I thought was a cute little guest house called the Hotel DeVille, and at $20 a night, it was considerably cheaper than most of the other options in downtown Shreveport, and it looked considerably nicer too. I called in advance to make sure that they were okay with late check-ins, and I mean late too, because I sometimes didn't make it to Shreveport until late at night or very early in the morning. But then, once they confirmed that they could handle that, I booked a room and was excited to see what the place was like in person. If it was as nice as it looked, then I'd probably be a returning guest around 2 or 3 times a year. But as it turned out, I'll never be going back to the Hotel DeVille for as long as I live. And so, like I said, I didn't get to Shreveport until late at night. But just as they said I'd be able to, I checked in with the late-night desk clerk and was given my room key. The place seemed really nice, but when I asked how many guests they had checked in, the desk clerk said that I had the place to myself. I thought that was kind of odd because nice hotels like that are very rarely empty, but having the place to myself felt kind of luxurious, or maybe more like peaceful. And so instead of overanalyzing the situation, I just went to my room and got ready to take a shower. I didn't unpack right away. I just grabbed what I needed for my shower, which included a toothbrush I hadn't taken out of the wrapper yet. I unwrapped it, opened up the little mini trash can to throw the wrapper away, but noticed that there was no trash bag in there. You know, like the little white kind that goes in the smaller cans like that. I thought about heading back to the check-in desk to ask the night clerk for one, but then I remembered that I had a little one of my own from CVS that I picked up my travel toiletries in, so I decided to use that one instead. I opened up the trash can and found it was one of those where you have to sort of slide out the plastic liner before putting a new trash bag in, so that's what I did. But then, I slid out the little black liner. I saw someone had scratched a single word into the plastic. Trafico. Now, from having told this story so many times now, some of you are probably going to be yelling at your phones or computers or TVs or whatever, something like, how could you not know what that means? Well, although I don't speak Spanish, I kind of do know what that means. It's just that what you're probably thinking right now didn't occur to me at the time at all. I was so tired from driving for so long that I honestly just thought, what a weird place to tag something like that. Like, of all the places to scratch your name or probably a nickname by the looks of things, why do it there, where most likely only the hotel's housekeeping would see it? I shrugged it off, put the trash can back together with a bag in it, and then threw away the wrapping and box for my new toothbrush and toothpaste. I then took a shower, walked back into my room, toweled off, and then started looking around for where the room's hairdryer was kept. And since from experience that's usually the deepest drawer or cabinet in the desk or bedside table, that's where I went first. I checked the little cabinet in the bedside table first, and bingo, there was the hairdryer. But after I took it out, I saw that there was a little piece of paper underneath it. Now, my first thought was something like, this better not be a piece of paper that says not working or all that, because I was very much looking forward to actually drying my hair. It's kind of relaxing and soothing. But when I took it out and unfolded it, I saw that all it said was, help me. And the second I laid my eyes on those words, my heart kind of skipped a beat. I checked the back of the paper, but there was nothing. That's all it said, help me. I looked around the room again, my eyes darting to every corner as this sudden feeling that something was badly wrong took hold of me. I was irrationally terrified that someone was in the room with me, but it was just me, alone with this creepy silence in the air. I didn't know what else to do. I wasn't sure if just a note was enough to call the cops over, so I took it down to the front desk to ask the clerk what he thought we should do about this. And the guy was still there, sitting at the desk reading a magazine and looking like he'd rather be at home in bed. I explained the situation, told him maybe someone had been scared or in fear for their life in that room that I was in, but after realizing all I had was a handwritten note, he just sort of dismissed the thing as sort of a little prank. I asked him how he could be so sure that it was nothing to be alarmed over, and he responded by asking if there was anything broken, or any blood, or anything like that. There wasn't. There was only the note, and then when I made that clear, he said what I'd been thinking. That it wasn't enough to call the cops over, so unless I wanted to check out or move rooms, there wasn't much else that he could do for me. I walked back to my room and just sort of sat there for maybe 10 to 15 minutes and then repacked my stuff and actually checked out. I literally felt like I was about to be the star of my own horror movie. I've listened to enough of your podcasts to know what happens next. Like I was about to get the dumb female supporting actress whose sheer ignorance and naivety gets her chopped to pieces in the opening 10 minutes. I'm not saying the clerk was in on it, and it was some kind of murder hotel like that H.H. Holmes freak that DiCaprio is set to play in that new movie. I just grabbed my bag and hurried out to my car and then drove until I found a quiet spot by the side of the road, away from any buildings, just trees and darkness. And I parked and locked the doors, and ironically, I felt way safer out there in my small car than that sort of eerie hotel room. I know I could have drove back into Shreveport to maybe find some place there, but I was just so tired and couldn't face the disappointment of going through the whole ordeal just to pay a bunch for a crappy hotel room. I tried to sleep, but even with how exhausted I was, it took me way longer than it should have. I couldn't stop thinking about that note, and I settled on the thought of I really hoped it was a prank. Because the idea of thinking someone had left that note there, genuinely, and I found it out way too late, it just made me sick to my stomach. With the attitude the clerk took of just, oh well, it was probably just a prank. It's no wonder you hear all these horror stories about women getting kidnapped and trafficked in those kind of places. Oh yeah, and back to that traffico thing. So when things finally went down on what that word really meant, I actually called the hotel to tell them how I thought both the note and scratched traffico word might be connected. It wasn't the same clerk that was on duty the night that I checked in, but I told them what room number I was staying in and where exactly the word had been scratched. And the nice lady told me to wait a minute while she went to check the room, and then came back a minute or so later to tell me that I must be mistaken. I said, "No, I think you're mistaken, ma'am," and then told her a second time exactly where the scratched word was. She told me that she had the exact trash can I was talking about on the desk in front of her. It hadn't even been emptied yet, and still had my toothbrush wrapper in it. She pulled out the plastic insert I was talking about, but according to her, there was nothing on it. And that's when I realized. Either she was lying to me, or the clerk on duty that night had swapped it out as soon as I'd walked out of the building. And whichever it was, I wasn't getting anywhere with that lady, so I just thanked her for her time and hung up, and just kept on driving towards Albuquerque. I told my Aunt Linda all about it when I finally got to her, and she took all that confusion and fear away with 5 little words. You did the right thing. Even if it was just some dumb prank, I did the right thing in alerting the clerk and then getting out of there when I didn't feel safe anymore. And then for all I knew, the person who wrote that note did so a long time before I found it, in which case their situation could have quite easily resolved itself. Linda helped me rationalize it, square it away in my head, and then after that I started to feel a little better. And I'm not saying I'm haunted by what happened because, like I said, I don't know for certain what I found that night. But even today I still wonder if I came across something very, very dark, and it only just touched the surface of what's going on at that hotel. I was almost killed by my ex-boyfriend, and I'll be changing the names to protect myself. Now I'll start with a quick backstory. At the time of the attack, I was 19, almost 20. My ex, Gavin, was 27, and we had a big chow-chow and a cat. The dog was his and the cat was mine. We lived in a 3-bedroom house. A few months before, we had allowed a friend to stay with us, Lacey, and it didn't end well, as she was just sort of taking advantage of us. The week leading up to the attack, Gavin had just gotten back from his work trip, which I believe was about 3 to 4 weeks away from home. And the week that he was back, he was completely out of it, unable to complete a thought. I'd ask or tell him something, and less than 5 minutes later, he'd completely forget or just not have heard me, just off in some other world almost. Then one day, I was very frustrated with all of this, and I'd ask for help with chores or for him to take the garbage out, only to be ignored. One day, he said that if it continued, he wanted me to slap him. Now, we had gone out for dinner with his mom 2 days prior to this attack, and she was obviously very worried about him, as there was clearly something wrong. And at the time, the only mental disorder that he had or was aware of was OCD, though I am now even more convinced that it's not what he had by any means. And the day of the attack, we had just gotten back from grabbing some takeout and were sitting on the couch in the living room. I had been painting my nails while he was playing Mario Kart, and he looked over at me and said, "Lacey put a curse on my family." I was dealing with my own really poor mental health at the time, so I wasn't really in a space where I could be focusing on his. I have BPD, and I wasn't sure what to do. So I suggested that he hop in a cold shower, as it had helped him earlier in the week to reset a bit. He walked into the bathroom, muttering to himself, and it just felt so off. Now, I don't know how to describe it. I just didn't feel safe. And I walked over and asked if I could call his mom for a bit, maybe invite her over for supper, kind of beating around the bush that I wanted her to come help him. He looked at me and just started yelling that all he needed was me. I walked out and started toward the living room as I was calling his mom. He came out of the bathroom naked and started yelling at Ollie, the dog, to discipline me and attack me. Mind you, he was trained as my guard dog. And at this point, I believe his mom had answered the phone and heard what was happening. He started calling me Lacey and saying that I needed to pay for what I did. I immediately ran into the bedroom with my phone, and his mom was still on the line. He kicked down the door, smashed my head into our mirrored closet doors, and threw my phone to the ground. He was screaming that he was going to kill me. I scrambled out of the bedroom, trying to get to the front door, and as I was passing the kitchen, he got a hold of me and wrapped his arms around my throat, again saying that he was going to kill me. I remember looking over to the table and seeing my cat, Sterling, all puffed up, and I had never seen him so scared. I was fighting to not go unconscious, and I couldn't breathe. I clawed at him, just trying to get his arms off my throat. I remember starting to see black specks in my vision and thinking, am I going to die? What is he going to do with my body? Then he started asking me if I knew what it was like to have unspeakable things done to me. And this is the part where I'm not sure if he was actually out of his mind. I have been assaulted inappropriately before, and it had been a year that month, I guess, and I was very open about how that had been affecting me and open about telling him. He threw me to the ground and put his foot over my head as if to stomp on it. And this was the only time that I had seen his eyes throughout this attack, and they were almost lifeless. His pupils were so dilated you could barely see the iris, and he was yelling over and over again, "Admit it, Lacey. You know what you did. Admit it." I just started apologizing, doing and saying anything I could to make him happy. And this seemed to work as I got the opportunity to scramble to my feet and race out the door, and I just wished that I'd left the screen door open. I ran from house to house in nothing but shorts and a sweater in February in one of the coldest provinces in Canada. I got into maybe 2 to 3 houses before I heard Ollie screaming, and it's a sound I can never get out of my head. I just dropped to the ground, screaming and crying, "Gavin, leave him alone," as I knew in that moment that he killed my dog. At this point, a bunch of the neighbors had heard me and came running to help. An older couple called the police and brought me into their home, not knowing if they were putting their own lives at risk. My parents were living in a completely different province. Someone gave me their phone to call my mom, and she was out for supper with some friends, and I just told her, "Gavin killed the dog and tried to kill me." The police finally showed up after what seemed like hours, 5 or 6 cars, firearms out and ready. They used a megaphone to tell him to come out with his hands up, and he walked out naked, covered in blood. Once they had gotten him into the car, a police officer came to talk to me while the others searched the house. And shortly after, an officer came up and asked how many dogs we had, and I told him 1 and a cat. I asked if Ollie was still alive, and they told me that he was dead in the bathtub. Gavin had killed him in the living room and then brought him into the bathroom, filled up the tub, and put Ollie's body in it. I asked about the cat, and they said they couldn't find him yet, and I was sure that he had killed my sweet boy too. Sterling was the only thing I could think about, and I went into a panic and was no longer able to give them any more information. I was in tunnel vision repeating, "Where's my cat? I want my cat. Find my cat." The officers asked if there were any treats that they could use to coax him out and where his hiding spots usually were, and they ended up finding Sterling alive. But he was so scared and attacking the officers They had blocked off the worst of the scene, so they had me go in to get him. There was still so much blood, and the smell of blood and feces was overpowering. Sterling was in the bedroom on the bed, just crying. I scooped him up and asked the officers to find my vape. And as I was walking out of the house, Gavin's mom had just gotten out of her car. She asked me where Ollie was, and all I could say was, Gavin killed him. And she just dropped to the ground and started bawling. 2 weeks later, Sterling and I were on a plane to my mom's. The court case took over 2 years, and I later found out Gavin had loaded our guns. And I never wanted to know how he killed Ollie, but when going through the evidence, an officer mentioned a baseball bat, not knowing that I didn't want to know. He only got 10 months of house arrest for all of this. And to this day, 2 years later, he still tries to contact me, blaming me for not getting him help earlier. And I think the worst part is that I do partly blame myself. Nestled along the banks of the Taedong River, the North Korea capital of Pyongyang is perhaps one of the most unsettling and enigmatic places on Earth. Befitting its moniker, the Hermit Kingdom grants entry to only a limited number of curious tourists each year, and those welcomed are subjected to incredibly strict regulations. Visitors must always be accompanied by a guide and are only permitted to visit a handful of carefully selected and delicately curated locations. Then, as for their accommodation, visitors are usually checked into one of the only hotels in the entirety of North Korea that permits foreign guests, a stark beige monolith known as the Yeonggakdo International Hotel. At 400 meters wide and deep enough for the passage of large ships, the Taedong River is one of the largest in North Korea and boasts a great number of larger and smaller islands. One of these islands, known as Yeonggak, is located almost smack bang in the middle of Pyongyang and is home to the eponymous International Hotel. Constructed in the late 80s on the island's far northern tip and opened in 1995, the 47-story hotel essentially serves as a containment compound for North Korea's foreign visitors, and guests are only permitted to check in following a thoroughly extensive background check. Upon entering the Yeonggakdo Hotel, guests are greeted by high ceilings, marble floors, and dark leather seating. Touches of rare opulence in a country like North Korea. But plastering the lobby's walls are garish reminders of both time and place. Vast hand-painted murals depict heroic, larger-than-life figures engaged in key moments of North Korean history, such as the nation's founding or their supposed victory in the Korean War. Others show scenes of joyful workers, farmers, or soldiers, all embodying the spirit of self-sufficiency and loyalty to the state. In each image, everyone is smiling, everyone is joyful, but they are masks which hide a terrifying but wholly unspeakable truth. Upstairs, rooms are decorated in very neutral shades of beige, cream, and light green. The furniture is functional, the bathrooms Spartan but clean, yet the hotel's more public spaces are anything but ordinary. At the top of the hotel sits a slowly revolving restaurant, offering diners a 360-degree view of Pyongyang while enjoying a blend of Korean and Western cuisine. While the hotel's casino attempts to add a touch of Vegas to proceedings with red carpets, gold fixtures, and the tinkle of slot machines for ambience. The hotel's basement hosts a gift merchant, a one-stop shop for all your propaganda needs, where things like books, badges, and posters are available to purchase. However, there is another area of the hotel that is strictly forbidden to its guests, and have thus become a subject of deep curiosity to both visitors and observers alike. The hotel's staff refer to it as the communication and rebroadcasting floor, but guests simply refer to the place as the 5th floor. Many believe the 5th floor serves a dual purpose within the hotel. The first is to monitor the movements and communications of the hotel's guests. The second is to ensure the compliance and loyalty of the hotel staff. Unlike the rest of the hotel, the fifth floor is said to be decorated in the style of a North Korean military installation, with endless grays and aggressive propaganda replacing the soft colors and warm welcomes of the wider hotel. Yet the fact remains that no one actually knows for certain what occurs there. Seldom has North Korea permitted Western photographers onto the fifth floor, and their explanation of the floor's purpose has been vague at best. Many know better than to go snooping around restricted areas in a country suffering a brutal dictatorship, but the same could not be said for one particular visitor to the Yanggakdo International, who through either valor or vacuousness decided to find out for himself. Born on December 12th of 1994 in Cincinnati, Ohio, Otto Frederick Warmbier grew up to be an intelligent and gregarious young man. Upon graduating high school, he studied commerce and economics at the University of Virginia and spent a year at the London School of Economics as part of an exchange program. It seems his visit to the United Kingdom sparked a deep wanderlust in young Otto, and over the years that followed, he traveled to Cuba, Ecuador, and a host of other European countries. By the summer of 2015, Otto had turned his sights on East Asia, and after some searching, secured a free trip to Hong Kong via another study abroad program set to commence in January the following year. But while researching his exciting new adventure, Otto came across a group known as Young Pioneer Tours. Run by two Western men and operating out of a Chinese city close to the North Korean border, Young Pioneer Tours advertised trips to destinations your mother would rather you stay away from, including the isolated and insular nation of North Korea. The tour group claimed to operate in close conjunction with North Korean authorities and that all visitors, including United States citizens, could be guaranteed their safety if they obeyed the rather expansive list of rules and regulations. Otto became captivated with the idea of visiting the capital of the so-called Hermit Kingdom and told his father he wanted to experience the North Korean culture and people for himself. He checked his schedule, realized he could attend a 5-day New Year's tour before departing for Hong Kong, then flew out to Beijing on December 29, 2015. Upon his arrival in Beijing, Otto met with other members of his North Korean tour group, which to his surprise included 10 other U.S. citizens. Then, after presenting Chinese authorities with special permits, they boarded a flight to Pyongyang and touched down in the early hours of New Year's Eve. After disembarking the plane, the tour group was immediately separated from their fellow passengers. They were then driven directly to the Yanggakdo International Hotel, where they checked in and were given some breakfast. After that, Otto and his fellow tourists were taken to Pyongyang's Kim Il-sung Square, which features galleries, museums, and a national library known as the Grand People's Study House. The square is cleverly designed to create an optical illusion, whereby the center of the square stands lower than the nearby riverbank. This creates the impression that the 170-meter-high Juche Tower, which stands on the opposite side of the Taedong River, is sprouting from the end of the square, when in reality its foundations lie much further away. Otto's North Korean guides were keen to showcase such architectural feats. Then, after a short stop at the Austrian-style coffee shop attached to the Korean Central History Museum, they returned to the Yanggakdo Hotel. Following their evening meal, Otto and his fellow guests were invited to partake in alcoholic beverages at the hotel bar. They were also invited to enjoy the annual New Year's Eve fireworks display, taking place at midnight over the waters of the Taedong River. But aside from that, they were not permitted to leave the hotel premises for any reason whatsoever. Scouser Danny Grattan, a member of the tour group from Liverpool in the United Kingdom, told journalists that he, Otto, and a handful of other tourists spent the evening getting drunk in the hotel bar. They watched the fireworks around midnight, ordered a few more drinks from the rather terse North Korean bartender, and then retired to their rooms at around 1:30 in the morning. Danny Grattan remembered Otto being quite intoxicated, but otherwise in control of himself. What happened next suggests otherwise. Otto was known to thoroughly research his prospective travel destinations, and he'd no doubt done a lot of prior reading to the Yanggakdo Hotel. Since visitors are explicitly warned to stay away from the hotel's communication and rebroadcasting floor, many returned home with eerie stories regarding the mysterious fifth floor. Otto had almost certainly heard of such stories and likely harbored his own personal curiosities. He'd also no doubt observed how quiet the hotel was in the wee small hours of the morning. So whether out of bold inebriation or some other unknown inclination, Otto crept out of his hotel room, walked down to the elevator, and hit the bright red call button labeled 5. When the elevator door opened in front of him, Otto Warmbier found himself on the legendary 5th floor of the Yanggakdo International Hotel. And all the stories were true. The color scheme was metallic, the hallways seemed endless, and the garish propaganda posters which lined the walls were unlike any his guides had permitted him to see. One image showed a North Korean tank crushing American and South Korean soldiers under its treads. Another depicted North Korean soldiers with bayonets, advancing on a scene where an American soldier threatens a mother and a child. The American is depicted in a grotesque, monstrous form as he lunges at the terrified mother, while the handsome and heroic North Koreans rush to save her. Other posters depicted the U.S. Capitol building, and the moments before being struck by a North Korean nuclear warhead. "The U.S. will be crushed first if they invade us," the caption read. Otto was no doubt exhilarated to have snuck onto the 5th floor, and after perusing the hallways for a few minutes, he decided to head back to his room for the night. But not without grabbing himself a little souvenir in the form of a North Korean propaganda poster. It's unclear which poster he took, and frankly, no one is 100% certain if he even stole one or not. But 2 days later, as Otto arrived at Pyongyang International Airport to await his flight back to China, he was arrested by North Korean officials. Danny Grattan, the Liverpudlian on the tour, later issued a statement to the Western press. "No words were spoken," Grattan said. 2 guards came over and simply tapped Otto on the shoulder and led him away. "I just said kind of quite nervously, 'Well, that's the last we'll see of you.' There's a great irony in those words because that was the last physical time I saw Otto, ever. He didn't resist. He didn't look scared. He sort of half smiled, then off they went." As the decidedly nervous tour group boarded their plane, Grattan hoped Otto would suddenly walk through the hatch, a relieved smile on his face. But the only other person who did was a North Korean police officer. "Otto Warmbier is very sick," he said, and has been taken to the hospital. A representative from Young Pioneer Tours attempted to talk to the officer, but was informed any further communications would have to be conducted via official channels. North Korean air traffic control then ordered the plane to depart, and having little choice in the matter, the pilot opted to obey their commands. Otto Warmbier had been left behind. In the days that followed, the country's state-run Korean Central News Agency announced that Otto had been detained for a hostile act against the state. They refused to provide any further details for weeks on end, but during this period, a Young Pioneer spokesperson told Otto's parents, as well as the Reuters news agency, that there had been an incident at the Yanggakdo Hotel. And to their knowledge, Otto had obeyed every rule and regulation put to him, but since their relationship with the North Koreans had suddenly soured, they were unwilling to provide any further information on his arrest or detention. Otto's parents had to wait a full 6 weeks before they got any answers, at which point, they came from the lips of their own son. On February 29th of 2016, the North Koreans held a press conference in which Otto was paraded before their state media. Reading from a prepared statement, Otto confessed to the attempted theft of a propaganda poster from a restricted area of the 2nd floor, with the changing of the 5th to 2nd floor being a way of deterring future thefts. The poster, which supposedly said, "Let's arm ourselves strongly with Kim Jong-il's patriotism," was intended as a harmless souvenir. But in the eyes of the North Korean judiciary, its attempted theft represented a serious crime. Otto also went on to state that the attempted theft had been committed on behalf of a Methodist church in his hometown, as well as a secret fraternity at the University of Virginia known as Z Society. However, both groups denied any association with Otto, with Time magazine later calling the accusations fanciful and implausible. Many believe the confession to have been coerced in some way, as not only did one observer remark that Otto was clearly under duress, but countless other former prisoners have detailed horrific torture sessions in which they were forced to issue false and damning statements against themselves. On March 16th, a U.S. envoy met with 2 North Korean officials to negotiate Otto's release. His attempts were unsuccessful, and just hours later, Otto was convicted in North Korea's Supreme Court on charges of subverting Article 60 of North Korea's Criminal Code. His trial, which lasted just 1 hour, included evidence such as CCTV footage, fingerprint evidence, witness testimony, and Otto's own coerced confession. The CCTV footage showed a man, identified as Warmbier by his North Korean guide, entering the staff-only area. This was followed by the release of a brief low-resolution video time-stamped at 1:57 a.m., showing a figure removing a poster from a wall and placing it on the floor. A hotel staff member told the court, "When I got off work, there was nothing amiss, but when I returned, I thought someone had deliberately taken the slogan down, so I mobilized security to prevent damage to it and reported it to the authorities." In his confession, Otto claimed that he had abandoned the poster after discovering it was too large to carry away. "I never should have allowed myself to be lured by the United States administration into committing a crime in this country," he said, in a statement quite clearly written by North Korean spin doctors. "I wish that the United States administration never manipulated people like myself in the future to commit crimes against foreign countries. I entirely beg you, the people in government of the DPRK, for your forgiveness. Please, I made the worst mistake of my life." His pleas fell on deaf ears. The court held that he had committed a crime, and I quote, "pursuant to the United States government's hostile policy toward North Korea in a bid to impair the unity of its people after entering it as a tourist." He was then sentenced to 15 years of hard labor in a North Korean prison camp. Human Rights Watch labeled the hearing a kangaroo court, while describing the sentence Otto was given as outrageous and shocking. And despite North Korea's claims to the contrary, U.S. State Department spokesman Mark Toner stated it was clear that they had arrested an American citizen purely for political purposes. Otto's parents, Fred and Cindy, met with numerous Obama administration officials, including then Secretary of State John Kerry, but North Korean diplomats proved prickly at best. It wasn't until June of 2017 that negotiations bore fruit, when Secretary of State Rex Tillerson announced that North Korea had released Otto following a full pardon for his crimes against the state. However, during a June 6th meeting with North Korean officials, a representative of the U.S. State Department was informed that Otto had contracted foodborne botulism shortly after his sentencing and had fallen into a coma after taking a sleeping pill. U.S. officials asked North Korea exactly how long Otto had been in a coma, and the answer they got was as shocking as it was horrifying. 15 months, they were told. On June 13th, Otto arrived at the University of Cincinnati Medical Center, where medical staff tried to determine what caused his coma and if there were signs of recovery. Doctors soon determined that Otto was in a state of unresponsive wakefulness, more commonly known as a persistent vegetative state. He was able to breathe on his own and blink his eyes, but otherwise showed no signs of being aware of his environment. The medical director of the team which transported Warmbier back to the United States stated there was every indication that Otto had adequate medical care during his detention. However, the release of 2 scans showed extensive damage to his brain, which doctors believed was consistent with a cardiopulmonary event that caused the brain to be deprived of oxygen. It wasn't exactly clear what had caused such oxygen deprivation, There was no evidence of botulism, nor was there any evidence of torture or abuse, and scans of Otto's neck and skull were normal outside of the already identified brain injuries. In fact, as one doctor phrased it, for somebody who had been bedridden for more than a year, his skin and body were in excellent condition. Otto's father held a press conference on June 15th, but declined to answer questions pertaining to his son's injuries. However, he did state that not only was he furious with the North Koreans, but he didn't believe a word they told him. There was no excuse for any civilized nation to have kept his condition secret, and to have denied him top-notch medical care for so long, he said. Sadly, following a week of discussion with expert medical officials, Otto's parents made the decision to have his feeding tube removed, and he passed away at 2:20 p.m. on June 19th of 2017. He was just 22 years old. Otto's parents released a public statement thanking the hospital staff for all their hard work, while President Donald Trump at the time condemned the brutality of the North Korean regime. North Korea, on the other hand, claimed they were the situation's biggest victim, accusing the United States of a smear campaign while stating their treatment of Otto was humanitarian. A spokesperson for the communist nation said, "Although we had no reason at all to show mercy to such a criminal of the enemy state, we provided him with medical treatments and care with all sincerity on humanitarian basis until his return to the United States, considering that his health got worse." At the request of Warmbier's family, no autopsy was performed and only an external examination was conducted. Medical examiners came up with a variety of theories for what caused Otto's oxygen starvation, including blood clots, pneumonia, sepsis, or kidney failure. They also said it was plausible that sleeping pills could have caused Warmbier to stop breathing if he had botulism and was paralyzed from it. University of Cincinnati doctors found no evidence of botulism, yet several experienced neurologists asserted that, given the length of time before Otto's return to the United States, botulism could not be altogether ruled out. The U.S. coroner who examined Warmbier's body after his death said that Warmbier's body showed no obvious signs of torture, but the word obvious is doing a lot of heavy lifting in that sentence. Otto could have easily been subjected to advanced forms of water torture. In fact, some have theorized that being waterboarded too heavily was the exact cause of Otto's oxygen starvation. Many who asserted that Otto had been tortured in direct contravention of the coroner's reports were ridiculed by those who failed to take such methods of torture into account. But in 2019, a Korean-American businessman detained at the same time as Otto claimed he'd seen a young Western man, almost fainting, and being dragged across a hallway by investigators with his head and face soaked with water. This sighting might have taken place just moments before Otto fell unconscious, never to wake up again. Otto's funeral was held on June 22nd of 2017 at his former school, Wyoming High. More than 2,500 people showed up to say goodbye. He was then buried at Oak Hill Cemetery in Glendale, Ohio, where students tied ribbons on every tree and pole along the funeral procession's 3 miles route, all the way from the high school to the nearby cemetery. A week later, the United States government announced that it would ban American tourists from visiting North Korea, with Warmbier's detention and death being cited as a contributing factor. In 2022, Otto's parents announced the creation of the Otto Warmbier Scholarship Fund, with his first recipient being North Korean defector Sa-Young Lee. Around the same time, Sa-Young Lee gave a talk at TEDx UCLA entitled "Our Bubbles of Certainty, a Perspective from My Life in North Korea." It's a very poignant talk, and one highly recommended to those who wish to know more about the Orwellian horrors of the Hermit Kingdom. Michael Kirby, chairman of the United Nations Commission of Inquiry on Human Rights in North Korea, once wrote that Otto's fate has become a metaphor, a kind of symbol, of a big story about thousands of nameless statistics locked up and oppressed in North Korea. They are voiceless, but Otto Warmbier speaks of their suffering from his grave. This happened to me in Tempe, Arizona, not far from Mill Avenue where all the bars are at. I was out bar hopping with a group of friends one weekend, having a good time, and I'd gotten pretty wasted. I have this terrible habit of wandering off and getting lost when I drink, and this particular night I had managed to get myself in a very dumb situation. After wandering down streets for almost an hour, I started to realize that I was very lost, and to make things worse, my phone was out of battery. At some point, I decided that I would just walk back to my friend's house, which I knew was somewhere north of an area that we were bar hopping. Now, I should mention that I am severely incompetent when it comes to directions and navigating in a city, so I didn't realize that I was a solid 7 to 8 miles away from my friend's place. As I was stumbling confidently along the empty roads at 2 a.m., a sedan suddenly pulls off the road in front of me, aggressively, almost blocking my path. Somewhat startled, I look towards the driver's side and see a rather large and mean-looking black gentleman staring me down. In situations like this, most people have one of two reactions. They either become scared and defensive or angry and aggressive. I, on the other hand, am an insane person and was just drunk enough to have no sense of the danger that I might be in. Now, I should mention that I am your typical privileged suburban white boy, not particularly threatening or big. And I proceeded to wave at the guy saying, "Hey man, what's good?" I'm not completely sure, but I think I was probably smiling too. I specifically remember the face that he made. It was sort of confused and conflicted, as if I were asking him what year it was. He paused for a second and asked me something, but I couldn't understand what he said. And I responded back, "Huh?" And he then asked me, "Where you going?" I told him I was trying to walk to my friend's place, but I have no idea where I am. After another pause, he told me to get in. Now, without thinking, I walk over to the passenger side and hopped in. Pretty dumb, right? Well, at the time, it seemed like a good idea. And once I got in, I was able to get a better look at the guy. He was covered in tattoos and was wearing your typical thug attire. I also noticed his arm was all bandaged. Oh, and he had a pistol clearly tucked into his shorts. And again, for some reason, none of this fazed me at the time. He asked me where my friend's place was, and I gave him directions. Now, I'm pretty sociable and talkative when I drink, so I immediately started chatting with the guy casually. I don't remember exactly what we talked about, but eventually he started telling me that he had just gotten out of the hospital after being treated for a gunshot wound on his arm, and his girl just broke up with him because of it. Apparently, she didn't like that he was in a gang and getting into gunfights. Go figure. He then told me that he was real pissed off about her and about getting shot, and he was driving around looking for someone to rob when he found me, and that he has served time for robbery in the past. At that point, my drunken brain started to connect the dots, and I thought about the roughly $200 that I had in my wallet at that very moment. But instead of freaking out, I just said something like, "Damn, man, that's rough." He also told me that he really wanted to be a rapper, and he was trying to get his music career started. I tried to be supportive, telling him to just go for it. And about 10 to 15 minutes later, we pulled up at my friend's place. Now, this is when I should have just gotten out of the car and told the armed man thanks for the ride, but again, I'm an insane person and felt like I owed him one for taking me all the way there, so I asked if he wanted to come in and smoke some, and he said he was down. At this point, my friends had already been back for a while and were all wondering what had happened to me. And as you might expect, they were awfully surprised when I showed up with a strange black guy who I now knew was a gang member who had debated robbing me at gunpoint. What the dude did next sort of sketched everyone out, though. My buddy lives in a house with a few other people. His room is at the very end of the hallway, and that's where they all were listening to music. He also has a huge safe in his closet that is visible as soon as you walk in the room. I didn't realize it, but my new friend had brought his gun inside with him, and shortly after entering the room after everyone said what's up, he took his gun out of his waistband and put it down right on top of the safe in front of everyone. It seemed like a really odd thing to do, but it was a lot better than what he could have done. I feel like it was a sort of show of respect, like he wanted to show that he wasn't going to use it. Luckily, I do have super chill friends, so they acted cool and were about to roll up a blunt, so A few minutes later, we all went back to smoke, leaving that gun in his room. The dude chilled with us for a while longer and actually seemed to get along with some of my friends who had a similar interest in music. He then picked up his gun off the safe and left without incident. Looking back, I realized that could have gone much, much worse, especially since my buddy had a lot of cash in that safe and could have easily robbed us at gunpoint at any time. And I like to think that although he was a criminal and a gang member, he was also just a guy going through a hard time, and a little kindness and marijuana prevented that night from going very, very bad. Hi, let's read. My name is Dinesh and I was born in Sri Lanka, but I've been living and working in Mumbai, India for the last 20 years. My daughter came across your YouTube channel around Halloween of last year, and at first, I wasn't sure if she should be watching such scary stories. But since she started watching, her colloquial English has improved a lot, and I'm happy to say that you're having something of a positive influence in her life. There's also another, albeit a little bit of an unusual reason why I'm happy she's watching your channel, and that's the fact that you take viewer submissions. She's 14 years old now, and although we have a fairly good relationship, there have been times when we've gone through some strain. Now, for example, when she was 12, she got into a habit of slamming her bedroom door whenever she was angry with school or her friends or what have you. Every time she did, which wasn't very many times, I was absolutely livid, more furious than she had ever seen me before. She felt victimized, and I can understand. Her brother has broken a window with his cricket ball before, and I didn't get as angry as I did. And I tried explaining that it was the sound that bothered me so much, but she didn't understand and wouldn't accept my apology. But she doesn't understand because there's something she doesn't know. And it concerns something that happened to me just a few years before she was born. Something that resulted in me suffering from a very prolonged and very acute post-traumatic stress disorder. For the life of me, I can't find it in myself to tell her what had happened to me. And so instead, I think I might ask you to do it for me. I used to be employed as a floor supervisor at the Taj Mahal Hotel here in Mumbai. And I first got the job in early 2008 when I was still just the tender age of 24 years old. I was very proud of myself to attain such a lofty position at such a young age because it came with a lot more prestige and pay due to the heightened responsibility. It could be very stressful at times because my bosses could be very hard on me, but it meant that I could seriously consider starting a family as my salary and lodgings had made me a very eligible bachelor. Just under a year into working there, I thought I could see myself working here for a long time. But then one night, everything changed. It was around 9:30 p.m. when it started. The hotel was bustling with guests and staff, and we were all very busy, and it was business as usual. Then suddenly we heard what sounded like firecrackers coming from the lobby downstairs. But our confusion turned to pure terror when we realized it wasn't firecrackers. It was gunfire, and our terror only intensified as the sounds drew closer. I was in the lobby when I saw people running, their faces painted with panic, and I remember the distinct smell of gunpowder drifting in the air. I remember ducking behind the reception desk. My heart was pounding at a mile a minute, and over the chaos, I could hear guests screaming as they tried to make sense of what was happening. These terrorists were members of a group who called themselves Lashkar-e-Taiba, who are a Pakistani-based militant group, and after forcing their way through the main entrance of the hotel, they began firing indiscriminately. They had automatic weapons, and their bullets tore through marble and wood, and the destruction from just a few bullets was horrifying. They tore that hotel apart. They were part of a group of 10 attackers who arrived in Mumbai via sea, more almost like a commando operation than a terrorist one, and then instead of attacking military, police, or infrastructure, they were gunning only for the innocent, unarmed civilians. And from my hiding spot, I saw some of my colleagues on the ground, and I couldn't tell if they were just taking cover or if they were hurt. Then I saw one of the terrorists dressed in black with a backpack firing at the chandeliers and laughing as the glass pieces shattered. And that's when I realized that they were crazy, maybe high on drugs or something too, because they were shooting at anything. Perhaps in frustration because there weren't as many people as they hoped gathered in that lobby that evening. I managed to dial the emergency number and I whispered our location in the situation to the dispatcher, begging them to send help as quickly as possible. And the next thing I did was the only thing I could think of to help prevent more losses of life. And I went back into the hotel's corridors to help guests find a way through the staff corridors and away from the gunfire. You see, the terrorists were not just shooting randomly. They were systematically moving through the hotel, searching for foreigners. I could hear them shouting in Urdu, demanding to know where foreign guests were staying, particularly British and Americans. And they were looking for high-profile targets, tourists, and anyone who could be considered an enemy. Myself and a handful of guests hid in one of the staff-only areas trying to stay silent, listening to the attackers moving through the hotel. We could hear their voices whenever they got close to our hiding place, and it made me tremble with fear every time they fired a shot. We began to smell smoke after a while too, and realized that they had set fires because the smell of gasoline, or some type of accelerant, I'm not certain, was very pungent in some areas. They seemed to be moving from room to room on the lower floors, breaking into guest rooms in the restaurant areas and then setting the place on fire, in the hopes the entire hotel might burn down. I heard them in the Wasabi by Morimoto. It's the upscale Japanese restaurant where they had taken hostages, forcing guests to the ground and shooting some if they moved or didn't comply. But anyone who had a Western passport on their person, they were executed without any questions. After a while, we started to hear explosions. These terrorists had brought hand grenades with them, and they were throwing them down corridors to flush out anyone hiding. I saw one explode near the kitchen area where some of my colleagues had taken refuge, and the blast was followed by screams and then silence. The terrorists then set up positions on the upper floors, using the vantage point to shoot at anyone trying to escape, and then shooting at the police as they began their response. There were reports of them shooting from windows at people below or at any movements outside, and it seemed they intended to hold the hotel and use it as a stronghold so the killing could continue. At one point, this was perhaps the most chilling moment for me personally, the terrorists used the hotel's internal communication systems, or the PA, to taunt and threaten us. They said all Hindus were allowed to leave the building, as long as they told the terrorists where any Western guests were hiding. And I must have shown some kind of silent reaction on my face or in my eyes because one of the Western guests started to beg me in a sort of whisper, "Please don't leave us." I told her I would not, and I meant it from the bottom of my heart, not just because I would not be able to live with myself, but because I knew it was a lie. There was no way that they would miss the opportunity to shoot somebody like me, especially now that the police were outside shooting back. Leaving my hiding place meant certain death, so I stayed right where I was and prayed for a quick ending. Eventually, the sounds of the Indian security forces engaging the terrorists reached us. It was a mix of relief and terror knowing that while help was here, the situation was far from over, and so we just stayed low, praying for it to end. When the shooting had finally stopped, we heard men speaking Hindi and English telling us to come out and that they were the police. And the relief that we felt was monumental, a feeling I will never forget. The once grand Taj was now a mess of bullet holes and blood and broken glass. I saw some colleagues that were injured, others I would never talk to again. The aftermath was a blur of helping where I could, guiding dazed guests to safety, and basically anything I could to delay my own emotional reaction. That was my way of dealing with it, being selfless, completely forgetting myself, because when I remembered it all, when I allowed myself to process what had happened to me, it was just too devastating. And the days that followed were filled with grief, and every time I tried to sleep, the nightmares would have me reliving the whole situation all over again. And the hotel, like the wider city, has healed, but the memory of that night has remained a constant in my life ever since, and the same is to be said for all those who have lived through those attacks. It was something I lived through, and I have talked about it with others, but I don't know how to tell my daughter why her father is the way he is. And so maybe, after this, she will understand why I got so angry when she slammed the door. It wasn't anger that she was seeing, it was fear, because that noise took me right back to the Taj, on what I thought would be my last night on Earth. Surprisingly, this is one of those stories I forgot about until a few days ago when I was talking to a school friend on call and I got reminded of this. She was pretty freaked when I told her. You see, this happened when I was roughly maybe 7 or 8, so some of the details are a bit fuzzy, but I remember it pretty vividly. This may seem like unimportant context, but my family had just moved to America and were renting the top portion of your regular suburban house in a pretty safe cul-de-sac. I had friends, they were triplets, about 3 or 4 houses down, not far at all, and every day I'd go hang out with them, and around 9 or 10 in the night, my older brother, around 11 or 12 I'd say, would make the 2-minute walk and come and get me and walk me home since I was pretty young. One night he came to get me as usual. The sun wasn't fully down, but it was getting pretty dark. We started down the walk as normal when he started casting glances over his shoulder. I didn't really notice until he shoved me hard away from the sidewalk and between 2 houses. Each house had a huge fence that separated their backyard, not ours though, and he'd made me crouch behind the fence. I remember being really scared but more confused since I had no damn idea what the hell was going on. More specifically, he was a pretty big prankster. Once he convinced me my older sister crashed her car into the ocean, so I didn't really believe him when he turned and said, "Walk behind the houses. I think someone's following us." Now looking back now, he was probably trying to keep me calm. However, whatever calm was left in my tiny 8-year-old body was gone the moment that I turned around and looked. The man had followed us behind the houses, and he was just by the edge of a few houses down near a different fence line. He had a black hoodie on, with the hood up, black sweatpants, and white sneakers. I had pretty bad eyesight due to some health problems, but back then it was crystal clear, and I could see with horrifying clarity that his jaw was just hanging open, like he was just standing there with his jaw hung open. It was horrifying. I think now that I'm older, maybe he had some kind of medical condition that affected his jaw, or maybe he did crack, I don't know. But back then, I could have sworn on God that I was seeing some kind of demon. Now anyway, my brother, when he saw that I was looking and getting ready to freak out, he told me, "Just run, as fast as I can to our house." And we booked it. Neither of us looked back, but we were so scared out of our minds. And like I said, we only rented the top portion of the house, so the bottom, with a sliding door in the backyard, belonged to some other tenant. I don't remember if she was home or not, but I remember tugging that thing open and locking it as fast as I can, and when I looked up, he was there in the yard, a little away from the door, just staring at us, with that jaw. Me and my brother told my sister and my mother immediately. My father was away for a work trip at the time, but nothing came of it, not until the day after. We went to meet my dad at his warehouse, which had a small live-in portion above it where we lazed around until he was ready to head home with us. Around dusk, he came up and told us that we might have to wait since the police were there. He walked us around to the back window of the small area to show us police officers all around the backyard area of the warehouses. There were a few in line and a white van parked on the grass by the edge of the woods. Like I said, I was pretty young, so I don't remember many details of what actually happened, but I do remember my dad, who hadn't been told about the day prior, telling us that they found a man and a woman in the van. The man, he said, had his mouth hanging wide open. He seemed really disturbed while telling me about the whole thing and wouldn't answer any more questions about the woman. Maybe she was dead. I have zero idea. I do know that they were arrested on trespassing charges. I don't know anything else, and I haven't asked about it. I doubt that he'd remember. It's been over a decade, and he's pushing 70, but it freaks me out to this day. I still can't believe it happened, and I don't have any answers for it. I talked to my brother briefly about it in hopes that he remembered more than I do, but all I got was a long tirade about whatever medical condition the guy probably had for his mouth to be like that. He's an annoying medical student now, and sometimes I think maybe the guy didn't mean any harm and was just drugged out of his mind, but this was in the world's safest neighborhood and doesn't explain why or how he showed up at my dad's workplace. This happened over 10 years ago, but I still think about how close I came to dying. I was already with my future husband when I met his cousin, and we had a lot in common. We both struggled with addiction and anorexia. We talked on the phone and met up to eat and see a movie, but he kissed me in his car, so I decided it was best if we just stopped talking. I told my future husband about the kiss, and he was understanding. I didn't tell him that his cousin got extremely upset over me turning him down. Some time passed and we started meeting up as friends. Since we were both starving ourselves, we always went to the same place, but after a couple of times I felt like it wasn't healthy for either of us to meet up. He asked me to meet up one last time and I stupidly said yes. We went to our place and during dinner he was talking about his apartment and job, how happy he could make me. I got uncomfortable and asked him to drive me home. It was really late, and instead of driving me home, he drove me to the forest preserve. It was pitch black because all the lights were off, and I immediately felt uneasy. We were alone in the parking lot, and I had a horrible feeling at this point that something was going to happen. He parked and turned off his car and then looked at me and said that we were meant for each other. I didn't want to upset him, so I just said that he knew that I was engaged and that we were just friends. He had a history of violence, so I was terrified at that point. He started getting really upset, and almost crying. He said that he loved me. Then he put his arm around my neck and held his arm down really hard on the right side of my neck. His arm was around my neck and I've been looking straight ahead when suddenly I woke up to a police officer at his window. He was asking if I was okay, and I was really scared and confused, and I had some vomit on my shirt and I'd wet my pants. He pressed down on my carotid artery for long enough that it actually knocked me out, and he was a wrestler back in high school. He was telling the officer that we were fine, and that I was drunk. He got a ticket, but I was too afraid to say anything because if he was arrested, my now husband's family wouldn't have blamed me, but that's what I thought in the moment. I said it was fine, but that I wanted to go home now. I thought if I said it in front of the officer, he would drive me home because he took our names and he wouldn't risk trying something else. So he drove me home and didn't say anything. I don't know if he was trying to kill me or just got so upset that he went way overboard. Regardless, he almost did kill me, and it really messed me up. A person doesn't vomit and wet themselves after a neck compression unless they almost died. And I told my now husband, but not right away because I felt like it was partly my fault for meeting up with him. I only saw him a couple of more times at the holidays and then he stopped coming. But he didn't dare speak to me after what he did. If that officer hadn't shown up, I don't know if I'd be here still. This happened several years ago. While it may not be as scary as some of the stories here, It was definitely one of the most terrifying, bizarre encounters I've ever had. I'm 33 and I live in the rural Midwest. I was born and raised in my hometown, and with the exception of a few months of living with my father on the East Coast, I've lived here my entire life. I've become pretty acquainted with the majority of the back roads in my area. One such road is an old highway that no longer has the traffic of days prior to the construction of the interstate that runs through the town. It's a long and winding road that offers gorgeous scenic views during the day and a quiet escape from the city at night. Along this road is a small lot with no more than 10 parking spaces, 2 picnic tables, and a single trash can. It's easy to miss due to the heavily wooded area surrounding it and the majority of the rest of the drive to it. And due to its secluded nature, it had played host to a fair share of teenage debauchery. I myself spent many a Friday night smoking away with my friends there. Needless to say, there were a lot of good memories attached to this place, and over the years, it's become one of my favorite spots to venture to when I need peace or solidarity. One night, about 5 years ago, my girlfriend and I are going through a rough patch. We had a big fight due to having to work early in the morning and her deciding to have a party full of her loud and intoxicated friends. And things escalated and I stormed out of the house and started driving towards my favorite spot. As soon as I was out of the city limits, I promptly cranked my angriest metal music and sped down the road, chain-smoking my menthols in an effort to calm down until I finally found the turnoff for the spot. I was happy to find no other cars in the lot, meaning that I wouldn't awkwardly stumble upon 2 lovers engaged in, the act. And I immediately jumped out of the car and sat down on one of the picnic tables, lit a cigarette, and stared at the stars. I sat there for several minutes until I decided to head back to the warmth of my car after hearing some rustling coming from the woods. Not wanting to become a chew toy for a coyote or an angry bobcat, I hustled back to my car and blared my music again, quickly forgetting the sounds that I had just heard. I decided to have one more smoke and then make my way home. I smoked it halfway through when, out of nowhere, I heard pounding coming from the passenger side of my car. I looked over to see a large hand beating against the window. I turned down my music that was still blasting, and as I did, I could hear a very angry voice shouting, "Open the door," while yanking on the door handle. Thankfully, my doors were locked, and after a few moments, the man disappeared from the passenger side and then reappeared out of the driver's side window while screaming and cursing at me to open the door. He was now punching my window trying to get in. I was frozen, in a mix of confusion and fear, but eventually snapped out of it and threw the car in reverse. It was so dark that I didn't get a good look at the guy, except for a split second he was illuminated by my headlights. He had a black zip-up hoodie with the hood up, a dark gray t-shirt and a ball cap. He was a stocky guy and had to be well over 6 feet as he towered over my Sonata. The only distinguishing feature that I could make out was a very large, dark beard. And I noped out of there real quick. I floored it across the parking lot and back towards the highway. And that's when I heard it. A loud bang that sounded like a gun. I slammed my foot on the pedal, took the first turn I could find, and once I was sure that no one was following me, I slowed down and realized that I was doing 90 on a gravel road. At the time, one of my best friends worked for a nearby gas station, so I made my way to tell him the whole story. We looked over my car thoroughly and found a couple of dents on top of the car and what looked like a boot print on my passenger door. We talked it over and ultimately decided to not call the police. It was a 20-minute drive to the location from the closest town. We were sure that the guy would most likely be gone by the time anyone got all the way out there. And yes, I realized that was probably ignorant of me in hindsight. I'm still baffled by this encounter. I don't know if this guy wanted to rob me, steal my car, or worse, but I'm glad that I made it home in one piece. was a freshman in high school, Alyssa was my role model. Alyssa was a senior. She was so gorgeous, confident, smart, effortlessly stylish, and always owning the room. Back then, I was too shy to talk to her. Seniors are already pretty intimidating to freshmen, but Alyssa was next level intimidating because she was such a queen. I didn't expect anyone to see me the way that I saw Alyssa, but I was pleasantly surprised in my senior year. And in my senior year, I started finding cute little notes in my locker. I wasn't expecting that at all, but I was really flattered. The first one said, "You were beautiful in that dress on Friday." The handwriting was neat and simple with a cute little heart at the end. More notes kept coming in, always in fourth period too, and I got a note every week or two. I know they came during fourth period because I checked my locker before and after every class, and they were all very sweet, and they said things like, "Your smile lights up the hallway. You shine brighter than any star. Your homecoming photos are straight out of a magazine cover. So stunning." There were more notes that I don't remember. They weren't romantic or flirty, and they looked like things that I might have said to Alyssa if we'd ever spoken. I thought maybe they were from a shy underclassman girl, and I had my suspicions. I didn't tell anyone about the notes, though. I really didn't want my friends turning this into an investigation and embarrassing whoever was leaving them. And whoever was leaving these messages, I genuinely thought they meant well. Then in the second semester, my schedule changed. My last class of the day was upstairs near my friend's locker. My friend's last class was near my locker, and we swapped lockers. I forgot all about the notes until my 18th birthday. And that morning, my friend handed me a note that she found in my old locker, and it said, "Happy birthday, princess." At first, she thought the notes were meant for her since any of those compliments could fit her too. But when she realized that the birthday didn't match up, she put two and two together. And come to think of it, I don't think any of the notes ever said my name. I admitted that the notes had been happening all year, and I explained that I didn't want to make a big deal out of it. Then my friends launched their investigation that I had been worried about. All the girls in our friend group became detectives trying to solve this little mystery. And one friend, who didn't have a fourth period class, stationed herself by the lockers to survey that area. And it worked. The notes weren't from a shy freshman or even from a boy. They were from a janitor, an older woman none of us knew. We all recognized her, but I don't think any of us had ever talked to her. She'd been leaving these notes for several months, watching me closely enough to comment on my outfits, field hockey games, and even what I posted on Facebook. I saw her at the last field hockey game of the season. She sat quietly in the stands. That was the only time that I noticed her watching me, but I have no idea how I didn't notice her watching me before. None of us brought this up to her, and she hadn't done anything technically wrong. But it all felt so unsettling in a way that's very hard to explain. I was a young guy in college driving back to campus from somewhere when I ran out of gas. It was getting dark, maybe 6 or 7 p.m. When I realized the gas had run out, I turned off the main street, and then with my car's remaining momentum, I glided until I stopped in front of some random house. I sat in the car, trying to think if there was anyone I knew with a car who had stayed on campus for winter break. No dice. So then I resigned myself to the fact that I needed to walk to the nearest station, fill up the little gas can for my trunk, and walk back. I grabbed the canister, and before I started walking, I leaned on the front of my car and looked up directions. And just then, a woman pulled into the driveway. She was also college age and wearing some sort of server's outfit, like she worked in fast food. And I was parked right out front of her house when she noticed me. She approached, a little hesitant, and asked if I needed help. And I said honestly, yeah, I'd just run out of gas, and according to my phone, we were kind of a far walk from the Chevron. She looked at me like she had just seen a ghost, though. And at first I chalked it up to it getting late, me being a guy and her trying to gauge if I was actually screwing with her. But it really struck me how afraid she suddenly looked. I tried to assure her that I had the gas can and didn't need to go with her or anything, that I could actually pay for it. And she took the can but refused any money. I waited there for a while. She came back, handed me the canister, and then just stood there for a second, and I could tell that she was deciding whether or not to say something. Then she just straight up asked, "Do you want to hear something weird?" "Of course," I said. And she says, "Today at work, I got this prank call, but it was a weird prank call and all that. It was just the guy on the other line kept asking me over and over, 'Have you ever run out of gas?'" And after she told me, we both just kind of chuckled, not really knowing what to say except thanks and take care. And it genuinely gives me chills every time I think about it. This happened about 10 years ago in an area between Seattle and Tacoma, Washington. My friend, we'll just call him R, and I used to regularly go to Tacoma to sing karaoke at a bar there. And to be honest, I don't think I've ever seen the city of Tacoma during the day. Now anyways, it's about 1 or 2 in the morning and we're heading back to Seattle and we have to stop for gas. He pulls over at this station and I'm buzzed and feeling good, so this creepy station doesn't even really register with me. As I'm sitting, messing with the radio, suddenly my door swings open. I only saw a flash of him because it was all blindingly quick, but he was kind of medium height, dark-skinned, like too much tanning that is, and had a blank stare and tattered clothing. I remember he had a black jacket too, like leather or something, but it was torn and holey. So here I am trying to pull the door closed, and I'm realizing this man is very strong, and he almost won the tug of war with me trying to slam the door closed, and if my adrenaline hadn't kicked in, I don't know. I do finally manage to get it closed after maybe only a few seconds and immediately start looking around for my friend, panicked and concerned and confused. R had already been yelling at the guy to get the F away from my car, and surprisingly, the man listens. R isn't the most intimidating looking guy or anything, but maybe the guy didn't want to cause a scene. I don't recall there being anyone else outside the station with us that night, but R was being very loud and forceful. So I'm watching the man walk away, and he's not looking back at us or making a sound that I can hear, which is what made this entire thing more unusual. R gets back in the car, and he's usually calm, but deadpan. Like when you see something terrible, but you're too scared to move. I look to see where he's looking, and he's looking at the creepy guy who's now facing us with that same emotionless stare, just watching us leave the pump and back towards the street. And my eyes are on him the entire time, too. We book it out of there, and that was the end of that. And to this day, I don't stop at a gas station at night at all if I can help it, unless another car is there or it's on a busy street. Chad Dable was born on August 11th of 1968 and was raised Mormon in the city of Springville, Utah. Following high school, he was accepted into Brigham Young University, but 1 year into his education, he applied to be a missionary, after which he spent 2 years in New Jersey. After returning to BYU, Chad graduated with a bachelor's in journalism and then went on to work as a copy editor for the Ogden-based publication, The Standard Examiner. In 1990, a 22-year-old Chad would marry a girl named Tammy Douglas, and the couple welcomed their first child into the world shortly afterwards. Outwardly, Chad was living the life of a clean-cut Mormon 20-something, but beneath the surface, he began to entertain some deeply unsettling thoughts and hobbies. For instance, while he was still a student at BYU, Chad developed an interest in cemeteries. It started as a part-time job, digging graves in the evenings after his studies were completed. But after a while, it seems Chad started to enjoy the act of digging fresh graves among those already occupied. Even after getting his copy editor's job over at the Standard Examiner, Chad maintained a second full-time appointment as the sexton of Springville Cemetery. He eventually resigned from his position in the late 90s, but only after becoming fixated on a new and very different kind of hobby. In 2001, Chad published One Foot in the Grave, a non-fiction book that chronicled his experiences working in cemeteries. Thanks to a few poignant tracks regarding mourning and mortality, Chad's first serious offering was fairly well received. But then for his second outing, Chad took a radically different direction. He began to write what might be referred to as Mormon end times fiction, stories that depicted apocalyptic situations and dystopian futures. They often featured thinly veiled versions of his friends and family as protagonists, with recurring themes centering around supernatural voices giving instructions to his characters. When asked where he got these ideas from, Chad gave a very interesting response. In the author's note of one of his novels, Chad explained that suffering not one, but two near-death experiences in his life had allowed him to see, and I quote, "beyond the veil." "I don't fictionalize any of the events portrayed in my books," he writes. "I'm really not that creative. My torn veil allows information to be downloaded into my brain from the other side. The scenes that I am shown are real events that will happen." While his claims were well received among certain sections of his audience, many were turned off by Chad's wild claims and wilder plot lines, and by 2009, his readership began to shrink. Chad began catering more and more to the mostly radical Mormon readership that remained, and to supplement his income, he began giving speeches at LDS events concerned with the second coming of Jesus and other such end-time scenarios. Over time, this led to Chad's religious convictions becoming more and more extreme, and by 2011, he was claiming to have visions regarding the end of days. He claimed to see earthquakes so powerful that California and Oregon would sink into the Pacific, along with wars so destructive they'd engulf entire continents. But it wasn't until 2015 that he claimed to hear the voice of God, and apparently, God was telling him to move to Rexburg, Idaho. But right around the same time Chad was driving Tammy and their 5 children over to Idaho, a woman in Texas was opening up one of his books, and her name was Lori Vallow. Born Lori Noreen Cox in Loma Linda, California on June 26th of 1973, Lori was raised Mormon and by 2015 was married to her 4th husband, Charles Vallow. Having married in 2006, the couple adopted Charles' grandnephew, J.J. Vallow, as the boy's birth parents were unable to care for him, and by all accounts, the marriage was Lori's happiest and most stable to date. But in 2015, when Lori became interested in Chad's Standing in Holy Places series of books, she experienced something of a spiritual reawakening. She became increasingly invested in radical religious beliefs, read dozens of books detailing near-death experiences, and began listening to podcasts hosted by excommunicated Mormons. 3 years later, in October of 2018, Lori attended a Preparing a People event in the state of Utah. One of the speakers was Chad Daybell. Enraptured by his vivid representations of the end times, Lori approached Chad following one of his speeches and reportedly began flirting with him. Chad then told Lori that he believed they'd been married in previous lifetimes, and after exchanging phone numbers, they began a secretive correspondence. Under the guise of maintaining a professional relationship, Chad and Lori made joint appearances on several episodes of the Preparing a People podcast. She claimed to have been captivated by his unique and outspoken beliefs. In reality, the two were conducting a deeply sordid extramarital affair. And over time, a small but deeply fanatical cult formed around Chad and Lori. He christened their organization the Church of the Firstborn before crowning himself its one and only leader. The group consisted of Lori and her brother Alex Cox, along with Lori's friends Melanie Gibb and Zulema Pastines, the latter of whom ended up married to Lori's brother. All had been raised as deep adherents to the Mormon Church, but on Chad's orders, they relinquished their beliefs with a chilling degree of relish. Despite being rejected by the mainstream Mormon Church, the concept of reincarnation played a huge role in Chad's belief system. He claimed to have lived 31 previous lives, some on distant planets while inhabiting the bodies of advanced species of xenomorph, and one inhabiting the body of St. James the Less, a figure from early Christianity. Lori, on the other hand, had lived a total of 21 previous lives, 5 of which she'd spent in the company of Chad, and one in which she inhabited the body of Mary French, the great-grandmother of the LDS's founder, Joseph Smith. They were sealed, as Chad phrased it, following their marriages in previous lives, and conveniently, this relationship superseded those of their earthly marriages. When follower Melanie Gibb suggested that Chad and Lori should divorce their spouses, Lori told her that they were not permitted to, due to information they were receiving from, and I quote, the other side of the veil. Yet while Chad and Lori had no problem granting themselves a couple of heavenly hall passes, they were incredibly judgmental when it came to other people. Chad categorized people as either light or dark, depending on whether he associated them with Christ or Satan. But his judgment was far from arbitrary. He and Lori employed a uniquely elaborate scoring system, making people up for virtuous or saintly characteristics and marking them down for morally dubious or outright sinful behavior. Those who scored highly were considered to be reincarnations of famous figures from Christian history, while those on the bottom end of the scale were considered to be possessed by evil spirits. If the group liked you and deemed you worthy of saving, they might perform what they referred to as a casting, a ceremony in which they try to cast away evil spirits through prayers and scripture readings. However, if the demons inside a possessed person were too heavily entrenched and thus impossible to exorcise, Chad and Lori claimed the only possible remedy was death. As you can tell, the passage of time saw Chad and Lori's beliefs become more and more extreme, and eventually, Chad began making apocalyptic proclamations and insisted the end of the world would come on July 22nd of 2020. He told his followers that he was guided by angels and could see hidden truths, while Lori claimed to be an exalted goddess, able to see the future and unconcerned with earthly laws. She became increasingly disinterested with her husband, Charles Vallow, and in February of 2019, she told him that she no longer cared about their marriage or their adopted son, JJ. Lori then loaded up her truck and disappeared for almost 3 whole months. When she finally returned home, she was confronted by her husband, and a vicious argument erupted. During the fight, Lori told Charles that he was possessed by the evil spirit of a man named Ned Schneider, and that this was the root of all the negativity in their marriage. But that's not all. Lori then told Charles that rather than a mere mortal, she was a living deity, assigned to carry out the work of the 144,000 on the occasion of Christ's second coming, which, coincidentally, was only 18 months away. There was much work to be done between that day and the date of Christ's return, and if Charles got in her way, Lori would murder him. The threat to his life prompted Charles to consider divorce, but ultimately, he decided not to give up on her. Lori was quite clearly suffering from severe mental health issues, and as her husband, it's reasonable to believe Charles felt a great deal of responsibility for her. But as the saying goes, no good deed goes unpunished. Right around the same time Charles decided to stick around and work on his marriage, his wife had stopped referring to him by name altogether. In secret text exchanges between Chad and her brother Alex, Lori routinely called her husband Ned, or Hiplos, the latter being the name of the demon thought to have possessed him. Lori told members of her small but fanatical cult that Charles had become a zombie, and that if he couldn't be redeemed through prayer and casting, there would be grave consequences. But before efforts to save his soul have even commenced, Charles Vallow discovered his wife's affair. Somehow, Charles managed to obtain the email address of Tammy Daybell, Chad's long-suffering wife. He drafted a long and heartfelt email informing Tammy of their spouse's infidelities after apologizing for the pain his revelation might cause. Shockingly, after reading through the email, Tammy Daybell simply deleted it and then blocked Charles's email address. Following a huge confrontation regarding the discovery of the affair, Lori left Chad's home to stay in Chandler, Arizona with little JJ splitting his time between his parents. Then on July 11th of 2019, Charles drove over to Lori's home to pick up JJ, but upon his arrival, he was confronted by none other than Lori's brother, Alex. There was an altercation between the two. Charles retrieved a baseball bat from the trunk of his car. Alex Cox responded by shooting him dead. 16-year-old Tylee Ryan, Lori's daughter from her third husband, later confirmed that Charles did indeed arm himself with a bat, but had run back to the house by the time the shooting commenced and couldn't provide any further insight into the moments before Charles' death. Incredibly, and most likely based on Tylee's testimony, no charges were filed against Alex, and the shooting was deemed to be self-defense. Neighbors reported that later the next day, they witnessed a very loud and very jubilant pool party at Lori's Arizona home. And by August of 2019, Lori had relocated her family to Rexburg, Idaho, in order to be closer to Chad. Upon her arrival, neighbors noticed that little JJ's behavior appeared erratic, and that Lori often left him outside to play alone, without adult supervision and for long periods of time. When confronted about this, Lori neglected to mention that young JJ was autistic, and instead told neighbors that he was, quote, her niece's drug baby. Just weeks later, Lori and her brother Alex took Tylee on a hiking trip to Yellowstone National Park. They walked the trails, ate snacks, but when their trip drew to a close, only Lori and Alex climbed back into her truck. Lori would later tell neighbors that Tylee had been accepted into Brigham Young University on some kind of early scholarship program for gifted high schoolers. In reality, no one would ever see Tylee again. A few weeks after the Yellowstone trip, on September 22nd of 2019, Melanie Gibb and her boyfriend, David Warwick, were staying at Lori's home. And in the evening, Warwick saw Alex Cox taking a sleeping JJ upstairs to his bedroom, and this marked the last time anyone would see the boy alive. A few days later, Lori informed Rexburg Elementary School that she would now be homeschooling her adopted son. But the truth was infinitely more disturbing. In October 2019, 2 Venmo payments were made from Tylee's account to her older half-brother, Colby Ryan, with odd messages attached. When he expressed concern towards Tylee via text, he received responses from her cell phone indicating that she was safe, but too busy to talk. Melanie Gibb later said that Lori and Chad were convinced Tylee and JJ were possessed and had become zombies. Zolima Pastenes also testified that Chad had told his followers how, shortly before the little boy's disappearance, young JJ would soon die. But JJ's death was not the only one Chad predicted around this time. He began telling his followers that his wife, Tammy, was in limbo after becoming possessed by a spirit named Viola. Her case was a severe one. If they didn't act soon, she was in danger of becoming a zombie, and that was something which Chad was never going to allow. Right around the same time Colby Ryan was receiving Venmo payments from his dead sister, Tammy Daybell returned home from an errand, parked in her driveway, and stepped out of her car. A masked man stepped out from the shadows, aimed an assault rifle at her, then pulled the trigger. Tammy screamed, but her shriek of terror was the only sound to pierce the evening silence. The rifle had misfired. Tammy later told police that due to his mask, she had been unable to identify the man who attempted to shoot her. Police warned her to be much more vigilant and to report any further developments. But it was no good. 10 days later, Tammy was found dead in her home, apparently from natural causes. Chad claimed that she had retired the previous night with what he called a terrible cough, and that she tragically died in her sleep. He also mentioned that Tammy had been experiencing low blood pressure, seizures, and negative reactions with homeopathic medicines, though none of her medical records supported his claims. 3 days later, at Tammy's funeral, mourners found Chad's behavior extremely suspicious. The funeral came so soon, but it still felt so planned, one said. Others said Chad seemed businesslike, and that he didn't seem upset, and that he wasn't crying but was trying to cry. Mourners were then deeply perturbed when Chad referred to his late wife as lazy and not easy to live with during what was supposed to be a heartfelt eulogy. Chad's sister-in-law, Heather Daybell, thought his behavior verged on the bizarre and later stated that he just didn't seem upset. In the weeks that followed, Chad began introducing Lori to his friends and family. One of his neighbors, Alice Gilbert, described her first meeting with Lori as awkward, as despite the fact Chad had only recently buried his wife of 3 decades, he seemed remarkably happy. Gilbert observed that the couple was very affectionate, laughing and joking with one another, even as Lori explained how her daughter had passed away just 6 months prior. This marked the first admission that Tylee was deceased, but since Alice Gilbert was just a neighbor, she had no inkling whatsoever of the admission's sinister implications. Despite the cryptic hints at their terrible crimes, Chad and Lori played the role of a happy, wholesome Mormon couple who had bonded over personal tragedy. But by late November, their masks were beginning to slip. On November 26th of 2019, police visited Lori's Rexburg townhouse at the request of Kay Vallow, sister of the recently deceased Charles Vallow. She hadn't heard from little JJ for weeks and was beginning to grow concerned, and so on the afternoon of the 26th, 2 Rexburg police officers stopped by Lori's home. There, they found Chad Daybell and Alex Cox, who informed them that while Lori wasn't home, they were more than happy to answer any questions the officers might have. When asked where JJ was, Alex Cox claimed that he was with his paternal grandmother, Kay Vallow, the same woman who had called in the welfare check to begin with. Officers knew that he was lying, but played along before asking Chad where Lori was. Chad replied that he, quote, hardly knew Lori and was only present at her home because he was a friend of Alex. Again, that was demonstrably false. Marriage licenses are a matter of public record, and seeing as Chad and Lori had gotten hitched in Hawaii just weeks prior, the cops knew that he was lying too. When they eventually got in touch with Lori, she too provided the police with easily disprovable information. She claimed JJ was staying with Melanie Gibb in Arizona. One phone call was all it took to prove this was a lie. Chad and Lori might have made grave mistakes in lying to the police, but they weren't entirely moronic. They knew the game was up, and just hours after police came to question them, they loaded up a truck with their belongings and fled to Hawaii. Right around the same time Chad and Lori were moving into a rental home on the island of Kauai, police officers were conducting thorough searches of their homes. Days later, the Rexburg Police Department officially pronounced JJ and Tylee as missing persons and asked for the public's assistance in locating them. Police also announced that Chad and Lori were persons of interest following their prompt departure from the mainland United States, and that the children's disappearance might well be linked to the suspicious death of Chad's late wife, Tammy. As interest in the case grew, so did the amount of media attention it received, and before long, News networks all over the country were broadcasting interviews with people who described the errant couple's beliefs as frightening, disturbed, and cult-like. Incredibly, Chad and Lori released a statement through their attorney on December 23rd of 2019. An extract from the statement reads as follows. Chad Daybell was a loving husband, and he has the support of his children in this matter, while Lori is a devoted mother who resents assertions to the contrary. All false allegations will be addressed once we have moved beyond speculation and rumor. Their statement was met with a response in early 2020 when a collection of the couple's relatives issued a public message begging Lori and Chad return the children. They announced a reward of $20,000 being offered to anyone who either returned the missing children or shared information directly contributing to their return. Weeks later, on January 25th of 2020, Lori and Chad were located in Kauai and were handed a court order requiring Lori to physically produce Ty Lee and JJ at the Idaho Department of Welfare within the next 5 days. The next day, police seized the couple's rental car and searched their rental townhome in Princeville. Both Ty Lee's debit card and JJ's iPad were recovered. Just hours after their Princeville home was searched, the Daybells were confronted by an East Idaho news reporter named Nate Eaton. Eaton asked them where the children were. Chad and Lori refused to answer. Finally, on February 20th of 2020, Lori was arrested by the Kauai Police Department before being extradited to Idaho. Her arrest prompted Chad to also return to Idaho, where he tried convincing his neighbor, Alice Gilbert, to put her home up for bond to get Lori out of prison. When she asked why, he told her Jesus had given him the idea. When Alice then confronted him on what he had said about Lori's daughter being dead, Chad gave a cagey answer about it being a custody issue and then promptly fled the scene. Months went by without development until finally, in June of 2020, police found human remains buried in unmarked graves in the backyard of Chad's home. The bodies were located in an area the Daybells family called the Pet Cemetery, as it had been used to bury their cats and dogs. As the property was being searched, Chad phoned Lori in jail to warn her about the situation. Then, after police found and began to unearth the bodies, he tried to flee the scene. He was chased down, apprehended, and then placed under arrest for concealment of evidence. Days after the discovery of the so-called Pet Cemetery, police confirmed the human remains found on Chad's property belonged to the missing children, Ty Lee and JJ. Ty Lee's body had been burned, and her hands had been cut off, while little JJ's body was relatively undamaged, having been wrapped in plastic before being gently lowered into the makeshift grave. However, unlike JJ, Ty Lee's remains had not been treated with such reverence. Her corpse was so decomposed and damaged that her cause of death could not officially be determined, while JJ's had been carefully dispatched with a plastic bag over his head and duct tape over his mouth, possibly after being drugged. Following the announcement that the children's bodies had been found, Chad Daybell was officially excommunicated by the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints on the basis of his religious teachings, some of which were described as those of a doomsday cult. At the trials, Lori was found guilty of the murder of her children. She received 3 consecutive life sentences for the murders and conspiracy, with an additional 2 life sentences and a 10-year term for grand theft to be served concurrently. She now resides at the Women's Correctional Center in Pocatello, Idaho. Chad's convictions came the following year when he was pronounced guilty on all counts, including murder, conspiracy, and insurance fraud. He was sentenced to death in June of 2024 and is currently being held at the Idaho Maximum Security Institution in Boise. If he's a man of conviction and believes he'll be reincarnated on another plane of existence, facing the lethal injection shouldn't be too frightening for old 31 lives Chad. But if those convictions waver, if his beliefs were merely a tool with which he could manipulate and murder without feeling an ounce of guilt, then it'll be a morbid comfort to know he faced the same mortal terror as those his victims did in their own final moments on Earth. What feels like a lifetime ago, I decided to go visit a friend living in San Francisco, which involved driving just over 1,000 miles from our hometown of Montrose, Colorado. My plan was drive all the way through Utah in a single day, spend the night at the Holiday Inn in a little place called Ely, Nevada, and then drive the rest of the way to San Fran after a good night's sleep and a decent breakfast. Thankfully, I made it on time and in one piece, but that didn't mean that the journey went smoothly. It might sound funny, but I'd never been to Utah before the drive to San Francisco. It's less than 100 miles west of Montrose, but if I left town, it was usually to drive east to Boulder or maybe Denver. I knew eastern Colorado could be pretty desolate, but Utah was a whole other story. By the time I drove through a place called Delta, the landscape looked like something out of a sci-fi movie. The road had been nothing but a straight line through the desert for hours, and about 30 to 45 minutes past Delta, I realized that I messed up. I should have stopped for gas when I had the chance, and by the time I realized my gas gauge was creeping towards empty, I started to panic a little bit. The last thing I wanted was to be stranded in the middle of nowhere, so you can imagine my relief when I suddenly saw a sign up ahead. It was the first sign of civilization since I'd left Delta, a solitary gas station sign which read, "Last Chance Gas 5 miles." I thanked God out loud, not that I'm really a believer, but you get where I'm coming from. And then a few minutes later, I spotted what looked like a small town coming up on the horizon. It sort of clung to the highway, this cluster of dilapidated buildings with peeling paint and broken windows. Not the nicest place I'd ever seen, but it was a very welcome sight. Gravel crunched under my tires as I pulled into the station, and there was no one at the pumps, no cars in sight, and no sign of life from the small store attached to the station. When I turned off the engine, I was suddenly struck by how quiet everything was. I glanced around and saw the town was eerily still. People talk about sleepy desert towns, but I remember thinking, sleepy? This place is in a goddamned coma. Approaching the gas pump, I noticed it was of an old model, the kind that you don't really see anymore. The nozzle felt heavy, and the kind of heavy where it feels like it was designed to just last forever. But when I tried to pump gas, there was just no flow. I shook it, gave it a tap against the pump, hoping that might fix it, but there was nothing. It was like the pump itself was just completely empty. Assuming that there was some trick to getting the pump to work that only the station's attendant might know, I went into the old gas station to look for some help. The door creaked when I opened it, and a bell rang, sounding weirdly loud, and the place looked old, very old. Snacks on the shelves were vintage, like those bright, colorful candies from like decades ago, and the cash register was almost from another era, all metal, very heavy, with just huge buttons. And the posters on the walls were very faded, showing promotions for movies and events from probably all the way back in 2001. And when I got there, this was, I think, the fall of 2009. I called out hello, but my voice just echoed back at me and no one seemed to answer. On the counter, there was an old newspaper from 8 years ago talking about some kind of festival, and the calendar behind the counter was stuck on the same date as that newspaper, still showing June 2001. And that's when I started to feel very uneasy. I went to check the back room, and the door was open a little, and inside was more of the same. There was a mug with what looked like old, dry remains of coffee at the bottom, a coat still hanging on the back of a chair, and a silent radio that was plugged in but not playing anything. I found a ledger with the last entry on the same day as the newspaper, and it was like everyone in town just disappeared on that day. I left the back room and saw through the window that the playground across the street was empty, swings moving gently in the wind, but no kids or adults around. Then on the way back to my car, I just felt this burning curiosity taking over my unease, and I decided to just look around a little more in the town before I drove off. Every door I tried was locked and every window was dusty with grime and soot, like no one had been there for a long time. In one house, the door was slightly open, And inside, it was like whoever lived there had stepped out of their house in the expectation they'd be back in mere minutes, but they'd never come back. A book was open on the couch. There was another glass of dried something with dead mold clinging to the rim of it, and upstairs, a kid's room had toys scattered on the floor like play had just suddenly stopped and never resumed. I knew that I shouldn't have been in there, but I just had to check. And after I backed out of that kid's room, two thoughts were going back and forth in my head. The first being, just what in the hell was I thinking walking around a total stranger's house? It was like I came to my senses thinking, what if all of these good but slightly untidy folks are at a county fair or something, and some psycho, me, is just wandering around their homes? I also appreciate how in denial that sounds, but never underestimate the mind's ability to try and rationalize things in favor of going into complete fight or flight mode. But the second thought was more in lines with, okay, I'm pretty sure something bad happened to these people, and if I don't get the hell out of here, whatever happened to them is going to happen to me too. And I hurried back to my car, feeling like I really shouldn't be there now, but also with that horrible feeling that someone was watching me, even though I was 99% sure the place was completely abandoned. In my car, I tried my phone, really didn't have any reception, and next I actually tried the radio, and it was just crappy static. I mean, I guess we technically were in like a dead zone out there. As I started the car, I was worried that I was going to run out of gas and end up stranded in the middle of nowhere. But that place had me so unsettled that it seemed worth the risk. If I got stranded, it'd suck, but it was damn sure preferable to staying in that place for even a minute longer. And thankfully, I had just enough gas to make it to cross the state line and actually make it to Ellie. But by the time I rolled into Chevron, I'm not even exaggerating when I said I was running on fumes. As I filled up my car, I noticed that I had some bars finally on my phone, but since I didn't want to use it at the gas station, they still had signs up back then saying, "Please do not use your cell phone." And I went inside to ask the clerk if I could use their phone instead, which would also give me the chance to ask them about that abandoned town. The clerk seemed to have no idea what I was talking about, but that didn't really surprise me, I suppose. What did was how matter-of-fact the deputy sheriff was when I called his office back in Utah. The clerk knew enough to know that I must have come through Millard County if I'd been on Route 50, so I knew I had the right people when I called them up after looking through the phone book. The first deputy I talked to knew what I was talking about and knew the place. They called it Millburg, that it had been abandoned for a number of years, and he just really didn't know why, I guess. I then asked if I could talk to someone higher up, and he put me on the phone with the deputy sheriff who, like I said, was very open about some things. He just wasn't so open about others. When I told him about the abandoned town, he actually gave me a little chuckle as he was like, "Oh yeah, you must have stopped in Millburg. The place has been empty for years now." He told me I had nothing to worry about, and despite it looking very creepy, there was nothing sinister about the place at all. More like, the place had been scheduled for demolition for a few years, but the people who bought the land couldn't get permits. So, till they did, Millard County had its very own ghost town, one that even attracted the odd tourists who actually enjoyed getting the willies from being in an abandoned place like Millburg. And I'll be honest, the sheriff's answer was actually very reassuring, and I felt kind of silly for having worked myself up into a minor freakout over it. But then, just before we were about to end that call, I asked the sheriff why Millburg had been abandoned. And he paused and then asked me, "Are you some kind of reporter?" And when I told him no, he said if I wanted to talk about it, I was more than welcome to stop by their office over in Fillmore, and he was much more comfortable talking about it face to face rather than over the phone. Now call me paranoid, but I think that was sort of like a bluff or something. I think he was counting on me to not stop by the office to talk about this, and he was kind of right because I didn't. I kept going towards San Francisco, and was only like an hour or so later than my schedule, so like I said at the start, I made it in one piece and on time. But it was majorly on my mind for the rest of that day, and my friends and I, who I'd driven all the way out there to see, had a long talk about it that evening, and it amounted to this. My friends basically said that yeah, something bad probably did happen out there in Millburg, but that it wasn't something I should be fixating on. The right authorities seemed to be on top of it, and no wonder the deputy sheriff was cautious of reporters. He'd probably been burned in the past after some loose talk made it into the papers, and my friend thought it was basically a case of my imagination getting the better of me after having stopped somewhere that I shouldn't have. I mentioned the fact that if I have stopped in Delta for gas like I was supposed to, I'd have just rolled through Millburg like it was any other town, and it wouldn't have been on my mind like it was. My friend then told me to live in that reality, pretend that I'd never even seen Millburg, because when it comes to events where whole towns disappear, sometimes ignorance truly is bliss. That helped me keep Millburg off my mind for a couple of days, but obviously when the trip drew to an end, I had to drive back the way I came. I considered taking a diversion and stopping in Fillmore to see if I could talk to the deputy sheriff again, but then I was reminded of what my friend told me, and after making sure that I had enough gas, I floored it after seeing Millburg in the distance, zooming through that town in barely 2 or 3 seconds, and I didn't look back, not even for a second. My name's Darren. I'm from Cornwall, and I don't know if this counts as a scary story in the traditional sense, but it scared me, so maybe it'll scare you too. So basically, a few years ago, I found out that an old schoolmate of mine had become the youngest ever person in the UK to be convicted of being a terrorist. The police raided his mum and dad's house back in 2019 and nicknamed him after they found instructions on how to make bombs. He went to court over it, but managed to dodge prison time because of how young he was when he downloaded the instructions. The local paper said that he was a neo-Nazi, and I'm not disputing that because apparently the old Bill found all sorts of Hitler stuff when they raided his bedroom. But when I looked into it myself, there was way more to it than that. When I first heard about it, I read every single article about it that I could get my hands on. I used to be dead pally with the guy back in year 7 and year 8 and seemed like an alright kid back then. But then apparently after I moved schools at the start of year 9, he took a drastic turn for the worse. The whole thing hit really close to home, so you can imagine I wanted to know as much about it as I possibly could, mainly because I wanted to know what had gone so wrong in the guy's life that he thought about making bombs. And that's how I discovered, while reading one online article, that my old pal had been visiting the website of a group known as O9A. And the article kind of glossed over any details on the group and stated that they were neo-Nazis and just moved on. But like I said, there was a lot more to it than that. Having read a lot about various UK neo-Nazi groups while researching my old pal's arrest, the name O9A jumped out at me immediately because I've never heard of it before. I read all about the National Front, National Action, and the likes of Combat 18, but never anything about a group called O9A. So out of sheer curiosity, I decided to do some research on them to see what my old pal had gotten himself into. Then from the moment I plugged the name into Google, I think my jaw stayed on the floor for the whole time. O9A stands for the Order of the Nine Angles, and that's angles, not angels. And to put it in the simplest terms possible, they're Nazi Satanists. They want to tear down society which they think is controlled by Jews and build a new one based on paganism and a sort of survival of the fittest mentality. One of their big beliefs is human sacrifice, which they think will speed up the downfall of civilization. But they're not all talk when it comes to actually inflicting suffering and things like that, as I found out for myself when I looked them up. In the summer of 1997, 2 Swedish members of the O9A committed the Keelers Park murder, which was where those 2 blokes tried to ritually sacrifice an Algerian man. Then in 2019, an American soldier was found out to be a member of the Order of the Nine Angles and was planning on kidnapping and killing his fellow soldiers in the name of Satan. I know you're probably thinking, Okay, I was with you till you tried making out that there's satanic terrorists in the US Army, but please, if you think I'm trying to mess with you, then look it up. The fella's name is Ethan Melzer, and there's a bloody New York Times article about the whole thing. And this is legit, not just some stupid creepypasta. The year after that, another soldier was found to be a member of 09A, only this was a member of a group within the 09A called, and you might want to spell this out instead of saying it so you don't get in trouble, the RAPE Waffen. The group of scumbags hatched the idea of violating white girls and getting them pregnant from it so that more white babies would be born. Like I said, my jaw is resting firmly on the floor by this point as I was reading stuff like that, and because it legitimately sounds like badly written blue hair fan fiction, I had to stop and look all this up as I was reading it, only to find out that, yeah, it was all true. Another one that sounded too insane to be true was the story about another member of the Order of Nine Angles, whose name I've got handy, but I don't know that you want to edit it out, but he's named Luke Austin Lane. He and his two mates were caught planning the murder of some Antifa couple. And yeah, I'm no fan of Antifa, but this bloke was actually planning on killing this couple's kids in front of them before finishing them off in turn. They're kids, man. What kind of scumbag deliberately executes innocent kids like that? And I just couldn't believe what I was reading, but it kept going. To prepare for the murders, Luke Lane and his mates killed a sheep, drank its blood, and then took a lot of LSD or mushrooms or something to go on a sort of spiritual journey. I read another thing about a bloke in Canada who killed a Muslim guy, and then I think he stabbed some Sikh fella, and then when he was caught, boom, police found out that he was a member of 09A. And there are loads more satanic murders like that, mainly in Scandinavia and Eastern Europe, and they're all connected to what is literally a satanic terrorist group. But to be honest, that's not even the half of it, because if you look up all the stuff that the Order's members are involved in, you start seeing this same sick pattern playing out over and over again. Excluding 2018, every single year for the past 7 years, a member of the Order of the Nine Angles had been arrested and convicted of being a child abuser, be that through having material on their hard drives or actually doing disgusting things themselves. Most of these incidents have been in the UK, but as of 2021, they've spread to America and Sweden too. But then, as much as you might think that these dudes are just straight up creeps, and hear me out about this one, I don't think that's necessarily the case. The Order of the Nine Angles has these 2 documents about human sacrifices. One's called A Gift for the Prince, and the other is called Calling, A Guide to Sacrifice. Most of their literature is absolute garbage. Like, it's legitimately difficult because of how much jargon and inside language they use, but there's one bit that really stood out to me. Something that makes me think that all the CSEM stuff is basically part of their ethos. The Order says that human sacrifice isn't just confined to killing people. If they were burning and decapitating people every week, they'd all be caught in no time, right? Well, to continually propagate human suffering without overly alerting the authorities, the Order distributes CSEM as a way of sort of feeding evil, if that makes sense. It sounded wild to me at first, too. I can promise you, but the more I read and the more I thought about it, the more it all started to make this sort of horrible kind of sense to me. The kids involved in this, it's them that are being sacrificed, and by distributing the images of them being abused, the Order of the Nine Angles is able to sacrifice them over and over again while corrupting other people in the process. Again, I know this sounds too insane to be true, but here's yet another example of it happening back in 2020. In April of that year, Russian police raided the homes of a group suspected of, and this is a direct quote from the Russian website Now, incitement to murder due to religious and racial hatred, and criminal activities against women. I think they thought that these dudes were just neo-Nazis, but during the raids, they found the men were members of a Russian-based chapter of the 09A called Legion Av Satan. Turns out one of these lads had burned down a really old church someplace, and it was never solved until they found photos of him setting it on fire in his house. But that wasn't the worst part of it. As I was reading about this group, I remember thinking, okay, well, at least these lads weren't pedos, but then lower down the article from the Russian website, I saw that they were. They had been grooming kids in this place, Krasnodar, where they lived, and were trying to get them into underage prostitution. And I imagined that they were going to profit in some way from it. But that's not the point with these Order of the Nine Angles people. It's about suffering. It's about the suffering of innocent people. And that's what they trade in, and it's because human suffering makes Satan more powerful, so they say. It has to be a specific kind of human suffering, though. The kind that doesn't improve a person. Things like grief, severe physical pain, or the lifelong mental scarring that comes with being abused at a really young age. And I'm sure you'll agree, the Order of the Nine Angles rabbit hole makes for some of the worst stuff you've ever heard, and by the time I'd finished reading about it, I was in two minds about my old mate not getting any jail time. He was 14 when he got into that order, 16 when he was arrested, so yeah, I can put that down to something a stupid teenage boy would do. But the order is no joke, and the fact that he had some of their human sacrifice documents downloaded on his computer was very worrying. I'm not saying that we should lock everyone up who does or says something silly on the internet, but reading through all the O9A stuff makes me wonder if a mistake hasn't been made. And I hope my old mate turns a new leaf, and it was all just a silly phase to him. I mean, he's definitely sorry that he got caught, because I know for a fact that he's got all kinds of restrictions placed on him. And don't ask me how I know. Everyone knows everyone in Cornwall, but I know he can't go on certain websites or talk to certain people, and if he does, he's in serious trouble. That'd definitely have me thinking I've made a mistake here, and I really do hope that he sees it that way, because honestly, the alternative is bloody well terrifying, isn't it? If he cracks on with life and it becomes something daft that he did back when he was a lad, then good on him. But if not, well, I imagine I'll be reading about him at some point in the future for whatever terrible thing that he does in the name of the devil. I used to do a lot of urban exploring out of Chicago, and me and my crew ticked off a lot of places over the years. There are the big grain silos in Pilsen, left empty after a big explosion, and then near Joliet there's an old prison with cells and chapels now open for tours. In Gary, Indiana, we saw this incredibly beautiful but decaying church. Then, under Chicago, there are old freight tunnels, mostly closed off now, that were anything but beautiful. The old Chicago post office was huge and empty for years, and there's the old Cook County Hospital, now becoming a hotel, but once a place right out of Silent Hill. But then, after a while, we started looking further to hit up places that we hadn't been before, and that's when we heard about a place in the middle of nowhere over in Iowa called Buckhorn. Back in the 1900s, Buckhorn used to be a pretty prosperous place because of the big creamery that they had in town. It used to turn out hundreds of tons of butter a week, and it employed almost everyone in town. But then, when rising costs forced the creamery to shut down, it meant just about the whole town was suddenly out of work overnight. And with no jobs, people started leaving, one family at a time. Then I think by the 80s or early 90s, the place was just a total ghost town. We did some research online, mainly using Urbex forums where others would post about their experiences, and drew up a list of places we wanted to visit. There was obviously the old creamery, which was huge and falling apart, but there was also the abandoned church and cemetery we could take a look at, along with a handful of other places too. It looked like a great place to explore. The only drawback was the 4-hour car ride, and since it was late October when we got the urge to visit, it meant starting the journey at the crack of dawn if we wanted to hit up all of our chosen spots before it went dark. So, one day in early November, we loaded up my friend Mike's van, and then we drove off down Highway 64 in the direction of the Iowa state line. The weather was miserable when we hit the road. A cold, gray Saturday morning that I'd much rather have just spent in bed. But honestly, urbex when the weather is nice feels kind of odd, and no filter in existence makes a place feel gloomier or creepier than a naturally overcast sky. And on top of that, the prospect of hitting up a brand new place kept us so excited that we didn't mind that the heating in Mike's van was completely broken. And besides, each of us was dressed for the Arctic, so the cold was at the back of our minds as we got closer and closer to Buckhorn. When we arrived, the town was exactly as you'd imagine, empty and silent, with buildings that looked like they'd crumble if you so much as looked at them for too long. The streets were overgrown with weeds, and apart from the sound of the wind whispering around the abandoned buildings, it was completely silent. We started at the old schoolhouse, a building that seemed to sag under the weight of its own rotting structure, and inside, the air was musty and dank, and there were leaks almost everywhere from the previous day's rain. How the place was still standing was beyond me, and I was way more worried about it coming down on our heads, even after I saw what was written on the chalkboard. Mike pointed it out at first, directing us into a classroom that had the word "danger" written on the chalkboard in big white letters with an exclamation point. Mike was smiling when he showed us, and it got a little chuckle out of me too. You see a lot of that kind of spooky graffiti around well-trodden urbex sites, and it's usually a little more creative than just danger. You pay attention to official-looking signs and warnings about unstable structures or active power cables and all of that, but when it comes to stuff like "Abandon hope, all ye who enter here," or "Pennywise's lair," you tend not to take it very seriously. And we figured the danger on the chalkboard amounted to some other urbexer's tag, like an unsettling way of saying, "I got here first." But these days, I think that graffiti was much more significant than we first imagined. We moved on to the other classrooms, checking the chalkboards for more messages, but there was nothing. And I remember the desk being covered in a thick layer of dust, and after wiping at some of it with his glove to see just how thick it really was, Mike started playfully chasing us around and threatening to wipe that grime on one of our jackets. And that's when I first noticed something was off with our friend Tom. He was usually the most enthusiastic of us. His camera was always ready, his curiosity was boundless, but that day, he seemed tired and distracted, almost like he was in some kind of daze. He barely reacted as Mike came at him, and when he did notice what was on his finger, he didn't really even find it funny. He just snapped at Mike, not overly harshly or anything, but we knew that the joke was over and moved on from the school to the general store. The shelves were still stocked with cans made by brands that we'd never heard of, and some of their labels faded so badly that we could barely read them. Tommy stayed quiet as we walked the aisles, which, again, was totally not like him. By the time we got to the old town hall, his behavior had gotten even weirder. He seemed like he was muttering to himself, his eyes darting around like he was seeing things that we couldn't. Then suddenly, Tommy reached up and just started clutching his nose. Blood poured out, dark and thick and staining his gray gloves, and he looked scared. We tried to help, but he backed up and held out an arm like, "Get the hell off of me." And his nose was bleeding so much that one of us actually asked if Tommy was good to keep going. But the idea seemed to just irritate him even more than his nosebleed did. He said we hadn't driven all that way to just turn around and leave over a nosebleed, and in the moment, I appreciated how unselfish it sounded. No one wanted to just leave, not if we could avoid it. So as Mike went into his pack to get our first aid kit so Tommy could stem the blood coming out of his nose, I wandered off alone towards the old sheriff's office to take a look around. It looked much like I had imagined it to at first. Reception area, back office, hallway leading to what must have been cells of some description. It wasn't immediately visible from the front door, but the second I turned the corner into the reception area, I saw it. In huge black letters, daubed in what must have been spray paint, were the words, "If you bleed, leave Buckhorn and never return." The sight of it sent literal shivers down my spine immediately, and I ran back to tell the others. I told them that we had to leave, but again, Tommy objected. And I started to explain that what I'd seen written on the wall of the sheriff's office, and as I did, Mike and the others started to listen. But I still only got a couple of words out before Tommy went nuts and started screaming at me. He says something like, "How many times do I have to say it? We're not leaving, all right?" Then as he started walking towards me, still yelling, others jumped in to hold him back, thinking that he was about to punch me. We worked to calm him down, and it kind of seemed like we did at first. But then, when I look back on it, I think that's when that weird kind of fatigue started to set in. We basically managed to drag Tommy back to the van after he stopped struggling because we were convinced that he was going through some kind of medical emergency. He offered to take him to the hospital, but all he wanted to do was go home. The drive back was just quiet and very tense. Tommy's nosebleed had stopped, but he was very pale, and his breathing shallow, and he passed out before we even hit the highway, and his body was just limp against the seat. We tried to wake him when we got back to town, but he was unresponsive, barely stirring even when we shook him. The fact that he even showed signs of life was a huge relief. Then, when we finally got him to his apartment, Tommy was acting like someone recovering from some deep sleep, very groggy, very confused. And we just left him to rest. And we asked his mom and sister to keep an eye on him after telling them what had happened, but we were all very shaken by what had taken place. The image of that warning on the wall, the nosebleed, and the fear in Tommy's eyes, it just all played over and over again in my mind. And lying in bed that night, I couldn't shake off the unease of what we'd seen. Why did Tommy react that way? And what was it either in or about Buckhorn that made him act like that? The warning in the sheriff's office was very clear, but its implications were terrifying. Was it some kind of chemical exposure? And if so, why was it only Tommy who reacted that way? I thought about the stories that I'd heard of Buckhorn, tales of that town that once thrived but fell due to reasons that were never quite clear. And I'd read about the creamery shutting down, but it didn't occur to me until then that it didn't say why the creamery was shut down in any of the posts that I'd read. Some spoke of economic downfall, but there was nothing about a mysterious illness or any other kind of unexplained events that led to its abandonment. The next day, I did some research, but found nothing that could really explain what had happened to him. There were no records of toxic spills, no known unusual occurrences officially documented. Yet the physical and psychological impact on Tom was undeniable, and we all saw it. It scared the hell out of us. He was the only one who bled and the only one who started acting strange like that, or at least strange in a way that we could see and recognize. I wrote this down not because I'm good with words, but because I need to warn others. If you ever hear about Buckhorn, if someone suggests a reason to visit, just don't. Stay the hell away from that place. Whatever's there isn't just the ghost of the past, it's something that can reach out and touch you and make you bleed, make you lose yourself. My friend has recovered, but honestly, you might pay a very high price uncovering whatever secrets that place holds. When I first heard about NXIVM, or Nexium, it was through a friend who had attended one of their executive success programs. She spoke glowingly about the personal development courses, the community, and how the teachings had changed her life. The promise of self-improvement, leadership skills, and the allure of being part of an elite group of thinkers and doers was intoxicating, really. I was at a point in my life where I felt directionless and eager for something that could provide both purpose and community. I attended my first Nexium seminar out of curiosity and was immediately drawn in by the sophisticated jargon, the sense of exclusivity, and the charismatic leadership of Keith Raniere. The courses were expensive but promised rapid personal growth, which seemed like a fair trade at the time. The workshops were intense, filled with long hours of introspective exercises, group discussions, and what they called ethical training. It all felt like a step towards becoming a better version of myself. Now, over time, I became more deeply involved, moving up through the ranks of their curriculum. I met many intelligent and successful people who seemed genuinely transformed by their experiences. I was part of a community that celebrated personal empowerment and seemed to shun conventional societal norms in favor of a more enlightened approach to life. The jargon, terms like ESP, Executive Success Programs, EM, Ethical Movement, and Vanguard for Raniere himself, gave us a sense of belonging to something special, almost like a secret society. The structure of NXIVM was intriguing too. It was hierarchical. The inner circles where you could move up by demonstrating loyalty, financial investment, and adherence to the teachings. There was always another level to achieve, another course to take, another way to strip away your limitations. This constant push for more was disguised as personal growth, but was really a tool for control, something I didn't fully grasp at the time. I recall the first time that I met Keith Raniere, or Vanguard as he was called by his followers. He had this aura of omniscience, like he could see right through you to your core issues. His talks were mesmerizing, filled with philosophical insights and psychological tricks that seemed to elevate your understanding of the world. But looking back, they were also manipulative, designed to make you doubt yourself and rely on his guidance, and my perception only really began to shift when I was invited to join what was described as an even more elite group within NXIVM, called DOS. I was told it was a sorority for women committed to deeper levels of personal discipline and empowerment, led by women for women. The secrecy and the promise of an even higher level of personal evolution was intriguing, but the initiation into DOS was unlike anything I had experienced at NXIVM before. It was here that the facade began to crumble. I was asked to provide collateral, sensitive personal information or compromising photos as a sign of trust and commitment. This was justified as ensuring my dedication to the group's secrecy and my personal growth. The discomfort was immediate, but it was too deep in the NXIVM mindset to see it for what it was at first. The revelation came when I learned about the branding ceremony. Women weren't just committed to a group, they were being branded with a symbol that, unbeknownst to them at the time, was a combination of Keith Raniere's and his partner Allison Mack's initials. The branding was done under the guise of a sisterhood ritual, but the reality was far more sinister. It was a sign of ownership, a mark of slavery. I was horrified. The realization that what I thought was an empowerment group was actually a front for a master-slave dynamic, and it was shattering. Women were expected to follow commands from their masters, which included intimate servitude, extreme dieting, and absolute obedience. The women were not just controlled, they were manipulated into believing that they were in control of their choices while being stripped away of their agency. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming. Here I was, thinking I was part of a movement towards enlightenment, only to find out that I was on the brink of being drawn into a cult where human rights were being egregiously violated. I felt betrayed, not just by the leaders, but by the system that I had begun to trust so deeply. And what made it even more chilling was the realization that many of the women in DOS were not just victims, but also enforcers of this system. They had been indoctrinated into believing that this was part of a noble cause, and their own status within the hierarchy depended on how well they could control others. This created a cycle of abuse where victims became victimizers, all under the banner of personal growth. And my exit from NXIVM was not easy. The psychological grip was strong, and there was the ever-looming threat of my collateral being exposed. But I managed to leave, thanks in part to supportive friends outside the organization who helped me see the reality of my situation. The aftermath was a period of intense reflection and recovery. I had to rebuild my sense of self, my trust in others, and understand how I had been so thoroughly deceived. This experience left a very profound impact on me. It taught me to be wary of where the path to self-improvement might lead, especially when it demands secrecy, blind loyalty, and the surrender of personal autonomy. It was a harsh lesson in the importance of critical thinking and the dangers of charismatic leadership unchecked by accountability. Looking back, I see how NXIVM used the guise of power to exploit vulnerabilities and manipulate minds, even control lives. The allure of belonging to something greater, the promise of transformation, and the manipulation through psychological techniques were all tools in the hands of those who sought to do one and one thing alone: dominate. On May 20th of 1999, the South Australian police were investigating a missing persons case linked to the city of Adelaide when they received a tip from an informant. They were to drive 80 miles north to a small municipality of around 300 people named Snowtown. Once there, they were to make their way to the old abandoned bank on First Street and conduct a thorough inspection of the bank's vault. 2 South Australian police officers drove for hours along the nation's A1 highway. Then upon their arrival in Snowtown, they parked their cruiser outside the abandoned bank. After gaining access to the secure structure and with their flashlights at the ready, the 2 officers crept down dark and dusty hallways until they reached the bank's vault. There, they found the large steel door had been left ajar. Then after pulling it open, they discovered half a dozen large plastic barrels. The officers must have had their suspicions, but to be certain, one of them crept forwards and peeled back just a small portion of one of the barrel's lids. And the stench was overpowering. After a total of 8 human corpses were pulled out of the 6 plastic drums, the Australian media went into a veritable frenzy. The previously sleepy village of Snowtown became the center of a gruesome investigation, capturing national attention and sending the general public into a state of near panic. They demanded a swift and robust response from the South Australian police, who were to open an investigation into the murders immediately. But they were told that, in truth, law enforcement had been investigating a series of disturbing disappearances for the past 5 years. And their case seemed to center around a man named John Bunting. John Justin Bunting was born on September 4th of 1966 in Inarla, Queensland, and it's believed that he had a relatively normal and stable upbringing. State social services have no records of him being abused or neglected by his parents, and until the age of 8, his school reports painted a picture of a perfectly normal little boy. But shortly after entering the 3rd grade, something terrible happened to little Johnny Bunting. While playing at the home of a neighbor, 8-year-old Johnny found himself alone in a room with his friend's much older brother. John was cornered, beaten, and then carnally assaulted by a boy much older and stronger than him, and the experience left him with a profound hatred of both homosexuals and pedophiles. As a teenager, he developed a healthy fascination with photography and was said to have a talented eye for composition. His fixation with human anatomy, on the other hand, was, to put it mildly, not so healthy. But on what bordered on downright pathological was John's obsession with acts of physical violence. At age 22, Bunting found work at a Queensland abattoir and was not only highly proficient in his work, but reportedly bragged about enjoying the factory-style slaughter he and his co-workers indulged in. In 1991, a 25-year-old Bunting would relocate to the Adelaide suburb of Salisbury, and here he befriended 2 of his neighbors, 20-year-old Robert Joe Wagner and 33-year-old Mark Ray Hayden. Bunting was known to be intensely charismatic and could exert significant psychological control over others. He also had a highly dominant personality, and relished the opportunity to take on a leadership role within his group, which included people who were vulnerable, disaffected, and looking for direction. Over the next few years, Bunting curated a small but viciously loyal social circle of those who shared his deep hatred for pedophiles, homosexuals, and others he deemed morally corrupt. But over time, what started as a kind of recreational outrage transformed into something deeper and darker, something more like ideology than opinion. He then went about convincing his acolytes that they should engage in vigilante justice, drawing others into his worldview through slow but persistent indoctrination. He would become a central figure in their lives, providing a sense of belonging or family, which was crucial for people like Mark Hayden, Robert Wagner, and James Vlasikis. These men became accomplices in what Bunting framed as a moral crusade, but was, in reality, a terrifying spree of sadistic violence motivated by greed, control, and prejudice. The murders began in August of 1992, when a 20-year-old man named Clinton Douglas Tresize was invited over to Bunting's apartment on the pretense of a social call. Bunting, having acted as both judge and jury, had declared Tresize an abuser of children. Then, right there in his living room, in front of his baying adherents, he beat the 20-year-old to death with a shovel and then had him buried in a shallow grave. In 1997, Tresize was the subject of 2 episodes of the Australian television show Australia's Most Wanted. Bunting watched an episode of the show with Vlasikis and his mother and reportedly boasted, "That's my handiwork." 26-year-old Ray Davies was Bunting's next target, because in 1993, he entered into a relationship with an ex-girlfriend of Bunting's named Suzanne Allen. Reportedly to be intellectually disabled, he was accused of making inappropriate advances towards Allen's grandsons, yet these allegations appear flimsy at best. Following the termination of their relationship, Ray Davies and Suzanne Allen remained close friends, and the former actually lived on the latter's property in a small caravan at the time he was targeted. To some, this was testament to the idea that the accusations had been spurious, but to Bunting, it was evidence of a vile conspiracy between the two. And on Boxing Day of 1995, Suzanne Allen's daughter witnessed Bunting and her mother clearing out Davies' caravan. Bunting later told James Vlasikis that he had murdered Ray Davies on Christmas Day, not only with the assistance of his wife, but also Vlasikis' own mother. They had reportedly stabbed him in both legs, immobilizing him before Robert Wagner strangled him unconscious. The group then drove 90 minutes to a home in a town known as Bakara, where they tossed their victim into an empty bathtub and tortured him. Initially, the purported purpose of the torture was to get Davies to reveal his bank details, and if he did, he was assured that his anguish would cease. It was a lie. Once the group had drained his bank account, Davies was beaten to death with the same sharpened metal pole used to mutilate his genitals. And next on the list was Davies and Bunting's ex-girlfriend, 47-year-old Suzanne Allen. According to Bunting, she was being targeted for execution due to her perverse collusions with Ray Davies. In reality, Bunting simply wanted her money. It's unclear how she was killed, but Allen's plastic-wrapped remains were discovered buried at Bunting's Salisbury property in May of 1999. Following her murder, Bunting claimed $17,000 of her pension through fraudulent means. Although Allen most likely died by Bunting's hand, charges were eventually dropped by the prosecution due to their lack of evidence, and the perpetrators were tried but not found guilty as a result of a hung jury. And her case was never tried again. Next up was 19-year-old Michael Gardner, a cousin of Robert Wagner's wife. By September of 1997, Gardner had been cross-dressing for a number of years, thus drawing the ire of the highly homophobic Bunting. Bunting had reportedly witnessed him playing with Wagner's children when he grabbed one of them by the arm and placed his hand over their mouth. Small children sometimes say some pretty terrible things, partly out of malice and partly out of ignorance. So from the sounds of it, Gardner had simply heard one of the children say something rude or explicit and was attempting to correct them with an easily understood but ultimately physical gesture. Yet to Bunting, the sight proved a potent reminder of his own carnal violation at the hands of his friend's older brother, and in that moment, Bunting decided Gardner had to die. He and Robert Wagner somehow convinced Gardner to accompany them to a place called Murray Bridge. There, Gardner was taken to a shed, then repeatedly strangled as a form of torture. Every time he collapsed due to lack of oxygen, Bunting and Wagner would force the teenager to stand up straight before they strangled him all over again. Finally, when Gardner passed out for a fourth or fifth time, Bunting kept his hands wrapped around his victim's throat, squeezing and tightening his grip until Gardner expired. The two killers then staged a robbery at Gardner's apartment, stealing some of his landlady's belongings. When this landlady somehow got in touch with Bunting to inquire after her errant tenant's whereabouts, he convinced her that Gardner had been the one to burglarize her residence in order to pay for a sex change operation. Gardner's decomposing corpse was then kept in a plastic barrel in the very same shed he was murdered in until it was eventually moved to the Snowtown bank vault. His left foot had been severed so the drum's lid could be properly sealed. Bunting's next victim was another ex-girlfriend, 42-year-old Vanessa Lane. Bunting had previously welcomed Lane into his circle of acolytes due to her willingness to aid in the hunt for child molesters, yet ironically, her home was firebombed after she too was accused of grooming a local schoolboy. In the aftermath of the firebombing, she attempted to lay low, but ended up beginning a relationship with an 18-year-old boy by the name of Thomas Trevelyan. Somehow, Trevelyan ended up reaching out to John Bunting, whereby he was informed that Lane had been grooming and molesting him long before he came of age. It's unclear why Trevelyan would betray his new girlfriend in such a way, but the move undoubtedly signed the woman's death warrant. And on October 17th of 1997, Bunting, Wagner, and Trevelyan picked Vanessa Lane up from her home, apparently following some kind of reconciliation. Lane was then prompted to verbally abuse her own mother via telephone, then told to inform her that she wanted nothing more to do with her, was moving to Queensland, and was never coming back. In all likelihood, Lane was led to believe that the rebuke of her own mother would prove her loyalty to the group. In reality, it was a trap. Should she suddenly disappear, Lane's mother was just about the only person who cared enough to report her daughter missing. With the relationship in jeopardy, Lane became an easy target, and one by one, her toes were crushed with metal pliers as she was tortured for her bank account details. When she revealed them, she was promptly strangled to death. Less than a month later, on November 4th of 1997, an increasingly unhinged Thomas Trevelyan began chasing a dog around his neighborhood while armed with a knife. Having reportedly been diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia, Bunting saw Trevelyan as a liability that, and I quote, would go mental on them. The next day, under the pretense of undertaking another bashing, as Bunting referred to the murders, Bunting drove Trevelyan to Kersbrook in the Adelaide Hills. He was discovered hanging from a tree in Humbug Scrub the following day. Next on the chopping block was an associate of James Velasquez, a 29-year-old named Gavin Porter. A diagnosed schizophrenic, Porter moved to Adelaide from Victoria following the death of his mother in 1997. He and Velasquez were heroin addicts, a trait which caused Bunting to dub him a waste of flesh, although it's unclear why Velasquez wasn't singled out for similar treatment. Porter was sleeping in a parked car on Bunting's property when he and Wagner attacked him. Once he was dead, his body was displayed to Velasquez potentially as a warning, before being put into a barrel for disposal. The group's next target was Velasquez's half-brother, 21-year-old Troy Eude. Velasquez claimed Eude had repeatedly subjected him to brutal abuse during his youth, prompting Bunting to add his name to their so-called kill list. They drove over to Yude's home in the middle of the night before they bound him, threw him into his own bathtub, and tortured him relentlessly. This marked the first time Bunting brought along a video camera so he could make a record of his grisly crimes. Once the device was rolling, Bunting used pliers to crush Yude's toes and increase the intensity of the torture if his victim failed to call him God or master. Following this period of torture in which Yude was forced to reveal sensitive financial information, he was executed by strangulation. Next up was Mark Hayden's nephew, 18-year-old Frederick Robert Brooks. Bunting became fixated on the spurious idea that Brooks had been, quote, touching up young girls, and decided that something needed to happen to him. September of 1998 saw Brooks accepted into the Australian Air Force Cadets, an occasion which Bunting, Wagner, and Velasquez claimed they wished to celebrate. Brooks was tricked into showing up in an abandoned property, a so-called party house, but all that awaited him was humiliation, torture, and death. The three men shoved lit cigarettes into his ears and his nostrils, and a lit sparkler was inserted into his urethra. A syringe was used to inject bleach into his testicles, which was wired to a variac, sending painful electrical impulses through his body. His toes were crushed by pliers before finally he choked to death on his gag. The next target was a physically and mentally disabled man, 29-year-old Gary O'Dwyer. Having discovered that O'Dwyer received sizable monthly disability payments from the Australian government, he was targeted by Bunting and his associates, who tortured him for his financial details before strangling him to death. The group's penultimate murder was that of Mark Hayden's own wife, 37-year-old Elizabeth, who was apparently on the verge of reporting Bunting's crimes to the police. After making sure that she was home alone, she was murdered by John Bunting and Robert Wagner after they forced their way into her home. Later that day, her remains were exhibited to her husband, who merely laughed before ordering the disposal of her corpse. Ultimately, the group's final victim was James Velasquez's half-brother, 24-year-old David Johnson. Bunting despised Johnson and referred to him using homophobic slurs on account of his cleanliness and sharp appearance. On May 9th of 1999, the group tricked Johnson into driving out to the abandoned bank in Snowtown under the pretense of purchasing a cheap computer. There, he was overpowered as soon as he stepped into the building, and following his murder, Bunting and Wagner reportedly fried pieces of his flesh before eating them. For years, Bunting's crimes went completely undetected, partly because the victims were people whose disappearances did not raise immediate alarm. However, suspicions began to grow as more individuals went missing under mysterious circumstances. A break in the case when Velasquez, the youngest member of the group, confessed his involvement to the police. Being the group's only heroin addict, it's possible that he was detained following a minor legal infraction such as theft or possession of illegal substances. Then, while in custody, withdrawal symptoms would have made him a ripe target for police pressure. His detailed account of the murders and the group's methods provided investigators with the evidence needed to unravel the full extent of the crimes. Police surveillance eventually led them to Snowtown, where the plastic disposal barrels were finally uncovered. The Snowtown murders resulted in one of the most complex and expensive legal proceedings in Australian history. Bunting and Wagner were convicted of multiple murders, then sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. James Velasquez received a reduced sentence after cooperating with authorities, but was still sentenced to life in prison with a minimum of 26 years. Mark Hayden, who played a lesser role, was convicted of assisting with the disposal of bodies and received a sentence of 25 years. The trial shed light on the group's twisted dynamics, with Bunting revealed as the manipulative ringleader who exerted an almost cult-like influence over his accomplices. The court also heard harrowing testimony regarding the suffering endured by the group's victims, painting a grim picture of the killer's utter lack of empathy as well as their boundless greed. The revelation of the murders shocked the tight-knit community of Snowtown, which had previously been known for little more than its rural charm. The town's name became synonymous with the atrocities, leading some residents to push for a charge in its name to escape the stigma. While the town remains officially named Snowtown, its reputation had been indelibly linked to the crimes. But beyond Snowtown, the case promoted broader discussions in Australia about how society treats vulnerable individuals. But ultimately, the Snowtown murders are also a stark illustration of how prejudice, greed, and manipulation can combine to create a strain of near limitless malevolence. The man we are about to discuss has gone by many names. He's been known as Dr. York, Chief Black Eagle, Isa al-Hadi al-Mahdi, and even His Excellency, Dr. Malachi Kobina York. At one point in his life, our subject went so far as to adopt the title, and this is a direct quote, folks, so don't hold on to your britches, Imperial Grand Potentate, the Noble Reverend Dr. Malachi Z. York, 33 degrees, 720 degrees. If you ask the man himself, he might tell you that he spent his life in the pursuit of knowledge. But the proof, it seems, is in the pudding, as despite his so-called quest for enlightenment, the man's legacy remains one of hatred, fraud, and child molestation. He might have granted himself all manner of lofty but ultimately meaningless titles, but to your infinite relief, I'll refer to him only by the name on his birth certificate. And this is the story of Dwight D. York. Throughout his life, York would claim to have been born in places such as Ghana, Baltimore, New York, or New Jersey. But according to his birth certificate, he was born on July 26th of 1945 in Boston, Massachusetts. He claimed that at age 7, he was sent to the city of Aswan in southern Egypt, where he supposedly received an Islamic education at the hands of his grandfather. Later in life, he wrote that, "My grandfather, as Sayyid Abdur Rahman al-Mahdi, the Imam of the Ansars in the Sudan until 1959 AD, upon looking into my eyes, foretold that I was the one who would possess the light." York then claimed that following his education, he returned to the United States in 1957 and, at the age of 12, settled with his family in Teaneck, New Jersey. By the late 1960s, a young Dwight York had taken to calling himself Imam Isa. He developed an interest in organizations such as the Nation of Islam and the Moorish Science Temple of America, but instead of joining one of the many pre-established black nationalist movements, he decided to found his own. After changing his name to Iman Isa Abdullah, he founded a movement that had become known as the Nuwaubian Nation, and with a handful of loyal proselytizers, he set about growing the organization among the ripe ideological seedbed of 1970s Brooklyn. Wearing green and black dashikis, York and his followers set up a bookstore specializing in black nationalist literature and would attempt to recruit those who visited. The method was an effective one, and by the end of the 1970s, York commanded a congregation of between 2,000 and 3,000 followers. Throughout the 70s, York and his acolytes imbibed a relatively simple mix of Orthodox Islam and black nationalism. However, as the 1980s rolled around, York began to preach a much different form of religion. While drawing from various religious and historical themes, he renamed his movement the Holy Seed Baptist Synagogue and unveiled a new logo featuring the six-pointed star of Judaism, the Islamic crescent, and the Ankh, an Egyptian symbol that also associated with pre-Islamic Sudan. This upset a great deal of his conservative Muslim followers, and the group began hemorrhaging adherents. But York wasn't done. He renamed the group a second time, calling it the Yamasee Native American tribe, and began teaching his followers that they were affiliated with the Muskogee Nation. He told them their ancestors had not been brought over on slave ships and had instead migrated to America during the time of Pangaea, a supercontinent that existed around 2 to 3 million years ago, which eventually separated into the continents of the present day. Naturally, this sounded nothing short of unhinged to the majority of his followers, who understood their roots were in Africa and not the Americas. And once he started changing religious ideas, the older followers became skeptical and left the group, said former follower Robert J. Rohan. That's what happened to me. He came up with an idea to move down south, apparently because he was under FBI investigation, Rohan added. But then he told us it's because we were moving to meet our spiritual parents. I guess he forgot to give us 2 explanations, and that's what made a lot of the brothers think that he was full of it. Following the announcement that the group was relocating to Georgia, York once again rebranded his organization. He changed his name to Malachi York, effective March 12, 1993, then declared his movement the United Nuwaubian Nation of Moors. A group that once numbered in their thousands now stood at just 200 to 300 strong, and ironically, York was more powerful than ever. He'd built up quite a war chest throughout the past 23 years, and due to the FBI's interest in his movement, many believed that this was done through illegal means. Yet the fact remains that York had enough capital at his disposal to purchase a 476-acre plot of land near Eatonton, Georgia, on which the compound known as Tama Ray was constructed over a period of 3 years. The New York Times later reported that the compound featured 40-foot pyramids, obelisks, statues of gods and goddesses, as well as a giant sphinx. Yet the Times also reported that Tama Ray was not York's full-time residence. Instead, York stayed at a $500,000 mansion in Athens, Georgia, about 60 miles away from Tama Ray, that he purchased with so-called community funds. After completely relocating the group in 1993, and utterly drunk on the power he wielded, York began preaching an increasingly radical form of his own personal religion, Nuwaubianism. The Southern Poverty Law Center described this belief as a black supremacist idea with worship of the Egyptians and their pyramids, a belief in UFOs, and various conspiracies related to the Illuminati and the Bilderbergers. The profile on their website included quotes from a letter penned by York himself, on which is stated, "The Caucasians had not been chosen to lead the world. They lacked true emotions in their creation. We never intended them to be peaceful. They were bred to be killers, with low reproduction levels and a short lifespan." Another Nuwaubian racial origin theory has Caucasians descending from Cain. Adam and Eve were sent to the Aegean Islands between Asia and Europe, where they started having children, York wrote. Each couple's firstborn child was an albino, and those albinos are called Cain in the Bible, and Cain is short for Caucasian. At some point after moving to Georgia, York began telling his followers that he was an alien. "I am an extraterrestrial master teacher from the planet Risk," he wrote. "My kind has been coming to this planet before it had life form on it. My incarnation as an Ila Mutajasid, or Avatara, was originally in the year 1945 AD. In order to get here, I traveled by one of the smaller passenger crafts called Sham, out of a mother plane called Merkaba, or Nibiru." York also informed his adherents that the so-called mother plane, or Nibiru, would launch the Crystal City, sometimes called New Jerusalem, to our solar system from its position in Orion. He claimed that this would be a 40-year process, by which the 144,000 chosen few would be transported to the planet craft Nibiru from August of 2003 to August of 2043. The chosen few would then be groomed for 1,000 years before being returned to Earth for the final battle against the Luciferians, and thus redeeming man from the 6,000-year rulership of the devil and his seed. To York's followers, his word was prophecy. Outsiders had a much simpler view. "They're a cult," said Ghazi Y. Kankan, a representative from the Council on American Islamic Relations. "They consider their leader a prophet, which means they have deviated from the Islamic way," he said. But York had not simply deviated from pre-established Islamic teachings. He had deviated from basic human decency too. As far back as the group's days in Brooklyn, York had established strict sexual practices within the Nuwaubian community and declared that he and he alone had the right to intimate relations with the group's women and girls, including the wives and daughters of his followers. Theodore Gabriel, emeritus lecturer in theology and religious studies at the University of Gloucestershire, wrote that, while extolling the virtues and importance of family life and the conjugal relationship, York denies relationships to his followers except at strictly controlled intervals. He urges his female followers to pattern themselves on the Islamic paradigms of the wife and mother, apparently desiring the creation of stable family units. But in reality, the husbands and wives are segregated in dormitories, separated also from their children. York permits spouses to cohabit only once every 3 months. They are permitted to meet in the green room prior to appointment only. Having managed to coerce his followers into allowing access to their wives and children, York's proclivities became increasingly depraved as the years went by. Many had suspected the FBI's interest in him was related to potential financial crimes, and while fraud and racketeering was indeed taking place, York was eventually arrested for something far, far worse. In 2002, following anonymous complaints that might well have come from his followers, York was arrested and charged with more than 100 counts of sexually molesting dozens of children, some as young as 4 years old. According to Bill Ozinski, who wrote a 2007 book about York in the case, when he, York, was finally indicted, state prosecutors literally had to cut back the number of counts listed from well beyond 1,000 to slightly more than 200 because they feared a jury simply wouldn't believe the magnitude of York's evil. It's believed to be the nation's largest child abuse prosecution ever directed at a single person in terms of number of victims and number of alleged criminal acts. Following his arrest in 2003, York attempted to negotiate a plea bargain with the federal government. The letter to the case's presiding judge read as follows: "Your Honor, with all due respect to your government, your nation, and your court, we, the indigenous people of this land, have our own rights, accepted sovereignty, our own governments. We are a sovereign people, Yamasee, Native American Creeks, Seminole, Washita Mound Builders. All I'm asking is that the court recognize that I am an indigenous person. Your court does not have jurisdiction over me. I should be transferred to the Moores Cherokee Council Court, in which I will get a trial by juries of my peers, and I cannot get a fair trial, Your Honor, if I'm being tried by the settlers or the Confederates. I have to be tried by Native Americans. As a Native American, that's my inalienable rights, and it's on record." Since York's appeal was grounded in his belief that he was indigenous to North America, the judge promptly rejected the appeal. York was then convicted of transporting minors across state lines for the purposes of molestation, as well as racketeering and financial reporting violations, then sentenced to 135 years in prison. York's followers assert a number of defenses, including that their leader, Malachi Z. York, who was charged and convicted, is not the same person as the Dwight D. York, who is listed in court documents as the defendant. Others say that York was set up by his son Jacob in coordination with Al-Qaeda-linked American Moss, who were jealous of York's influence among African-American Muslims. York himself believes that his betrayal, arrest, trial, and imprisonment, along with his eventual release, were foretold in Chapter 10 of Zecharia Sitchin's book, The War of the Gods and the Men, with York claiming to be represented by the supreme Egyptian deity, Ra. York's followers then said that since 1999, York has been the Consul General of Monrovia, Liberia, under the appointment of then-President Charles Taylor. They argued that he should be given diplomatic immunity from prosecution and extradited as a persona non grata to Liberia, but both American and Liberian officials have rejected this claim. As of 2024, Dwight York is serving his sentence at the United States Penitentiary Administrative Maximum Facility in Florence, Colorado. He is inmate number 17911-054 in solitary confinement for 23 hours a day with a projected release date of July 12th of the year 2120. If Dr. York, or Chief Black Eagle, or whatever he wants to call himself, is indeed an intergalactic educator from a distant planet, then maybe he'll survive long enough to see that release date. If not, and he proves to be a mere mortal, then he'll die where a man of his character belongs, cold, alone, and far away from the innocent. The Flannan Isles, or Seven Hunters, are an isolated chain of islands situated more than 40 miles off the Scottish mainland. These uninhabited islands, which stand proud among the unforgiving North Atlantic, are accessible only by private boat or rare tours, with their harsh weather and rugged cliffs deterring all but the hardiest of visitors. The largest of these far-flung islands is known as Eilean Mor, and is known to naturalists as being a sanctuary for seabirds such as the Atlantic puffin, the black-legged kittiwake, and the European shag. It was also the site of one of the most perplexing and haunting mysteries of the 20th century. The Flannan Isles lighthouse was constructed on Eilean Mor between the years of 1895 and 1899, with the purpose of guiding ships through the treacherous waters of the North Atlantic. Designed by David Allen Stevenson and standing at 75 feet tall, the lighthouse represented a significant feat of engineering, and its construction, amidst harsh winds and unforgiving seas, could in itself be considered an immense achievement. It was first lit on December 7th of 1899, with 3 full-time lighthouse keepers being appointed: James Duckett, Thomas Marshall, and a man named William Ross. However, during the winter of 1899, Mr. Ross came down with a rather debilitating illness and was temporarily replaced by a man named Donald MacArthur. The keeper's daily routine included maintaining the lighthouse, ensuring the light was operational, and logging weather conditions in addition to any notable events. They were trusted to be reliable and punctual in their routine, and for more than a year, they were. But on December 15th of the year 1900, entries in the logbook suddenly and inexplicably ceased. 3 days later, on December 18th, a steamer sailing from Philadelphia to Scotland reported that Flannan Lighthouse had gone dark. The report was not immediately acted upon due to severe weather conditions, which delayed any investigation until December 26th, when a lighthouse relief vessel could finally be dispatched to the island. Upon arrival, the crew of the relief vessel expected some kind of mechanical problem, but after making their way to the almost 100-foot-tall monolith, they found it completely abandoned. The entrance gate and the main door were closed, the beds were unmade, and the lighthouse's clock had stopped. Inside the kitchen, a meal had been laid out, but not eaten, and one set of oilskins was missing, suggesting at least one keeper had gone outside for some reason. There were no signs of struggle or violence, just an eerie silence, and the enduring question of just what in the hell happened to our 3 lighthouse keepers. One of the most widely accepted explanations is that while securing equipment on the notoriously perilous West Landing, the keepers were caught by a massive freak wave, which washed all 3 from the island in one fell swoop. Evidence which points to this include bent iron railings, a displaced rock, and scattered supplies, indicating a sudden storm of significant force struck the island, catching the keepers unprepared. Despite no such storm being recorded elsewhere, and thus casting a great deal of doubt on such a theory, weather patterns on the region can be unpredictable. It's therefore very possible a rogue wave or freak storm hit an isolated area around the lighthouse and swept the doomed lighthouse keepers from the island. Another theory suggested a violent, potentially deadly altercation between the lighthouse keepers, one that ended in a fatal accident or perhaps even murder. Donald MacArthur was known to have a volatile personality and might well have instigated some kind of physical confrontation. Additionally, the isolation of lighthouse duties can strain relationships, leading to heightened tension. Yet the lack of any signs of a scuffle or violence in the lighthouse makes this theory less plausible unless the conflict occurred outside, whereby evidence could be washed away by the sea. The isolation and history of the Flannan Isles, once a place of pagan worship, have fueled supernatural theories. Local folklore speaks of spirits or so-called fairy storms that could have whisked the men away. However, this is more folklore than fact, but has been popularized in various cultural representations like poems and songs. The Flannan Isles do indeed have a rich tapestry of myth and legend, including tales of sea monsters and ancient gods. Yet while these stories enhance the mystery's allure, they offer no plausible explanation to those grounded in logic and reason. More improbable theories include abduction by foreign agents, or the keepers choosing to escape their secluded lives in what might be called voluntary disappearances. While such theories are intriguing, they are largely unsupported by evidence and lean heavily into the realm of speculation. Though highly unlikely due to the logistics of such an operation on a remote island, the idea of abduction might entertain those who enjoy spy thrillers, but no geopolitical context or motive supports this theory. As for escape, the men have no apparent reason to abandon their posts and lives, and this comes after extensive testimony from friends and family. Another practical explanation suggests that one keeper went out to check on or secure supplies, and the others followed in an attempt to warn him against it. Then, after falling into the sea somehow, the keepers attempted to rescue their drowning comrade and were taken by the seas in turn. This theory accounts for the missing oilskins, yet it doesn't explain why all three went out in bad weather. Perhaps one keeper noticed something amiss with the external equipment, prompting him to exit the lighthouse, and given the camaraderie among lighthouse keepers, it's conceivable the others would follow to assist, only to be overwhelmed by unexpected weather. Britain's Northern Lighthouse Board conducted an official inquiry, concluding that in all likelihood, the keepers had likely swept away out to sea during a storm and drowned. However, the lack of concrete evidence fueled a great deal of morbid speculation among the general public. Superintendent Robert Muirhead, who claimed to have known the keepers personally, visited the lighthouse in the aftermath of their disappearance. He was among the first to conclude that it was nothing but a tragic and unforeseen accident, and while many agreed, others have accused him of organizing a cover-up. And following the incident, safety measures at lighthouses were reassessed, and this led to the introduction of better equipment, more reliable communication systems, and protocols for emergency situations that ensure that no such disappearance can reoccur in the future. The mystery has not only inspired countless stories, poems, and films, but also led to the improvements in lighthouse safety protocols, including better weather monitoring and emergency signaling systems. Theories abound, but without definitive proof, the fate of James Duckett, Thomas Marshall, and Donald MacArthur continues to be a subject of intrigue and debate. Even now, more than 100 years later, the incident serves as a poignant reminder of the solitude and peril faced by those who keep watch over the sea, ensuring the safety of others at the cost of their own. Hey friends, thanks for listening. click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos on YouTube every Monday and Thursday at 9 p.m. EST, and there are super fun live streams on Sundays and Wednesday nights. And if you got a story, be sure to submit them over my email, letsreadsubmissions@gmail.com, and you might even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click the big join button here on YouTube to hear about the extra perks for members of the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories and big compilations located anywhere you listen to podcasts. All of these links are down below. Thank you so much, friends, and I'll see you again soon.